Summer 1880, Montana Territory. When Caleb Turner rode past the Hendricks Gate that scorching July afternoon, he never expected to find a woman standing alone beside an overturned trunk, clutching a crumpled letter with trembling hands. The mail-order bride his neighbor had sent for, then coldly rejected before she'd even stepped foot on his land. One look at her tear-streaked face, and Caleb knew his quiet life was about to change forever. Stay with me until the end of this story, and drop a comment with your city name so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The Montana sun hung merciless in the afternoon sky, turning the dirt road into ribbons of dust that clung to everything they touched. Caleb Turner guided his mare, Sadie, along the familiar path toward town, his mind occupied with the mundane concerns of a rancher in high summer, fence posts that needed replacing, cattle that required moving to higher pasture, the persistent leak in his barn roof that he'd been meaning to fix for 3 weeks now. He was a man of 32 years, weathered by wind and work, with hands that bore the permanent stains of labor and eyes that had learned to read the sky better than any book. His ranch, modest by the standards of the wealthy cattlemen who dominated the territory, was enough for him. 200 acres of rolling grassland, a sturdy house he'd built with his own hands, a barn that had seen better days but still stood proud against the elements. It wasn't much, but it was his, earned through sweat and stubbornness after his father had passed 7 years prior. The Turner place sat a good 4 miles from the nearest neighbor, which suited Caleb just fine. He'd never been one for small talk or social gatherings, preferring the honest company of horses and the straightforward language of hard work. His only regular human contact came from his monthly trips to town for supplies and the occasional nod exchanged with Marcus Hendricks, whose sprawling ranch bordered his own to the east. Hendricks was a different breed entirely, loud, ambitious, always scheming about how to expand his holdings and increase his wealth. The man had inherited his father's empire and seemed determined to double it before his 40th birthday. Caleb had little use for him, but neighborly courtesy demanded a certain level of civility, so they maintained a cordial if distant relationship. As Caleb approached the boundary between their properties, something unusual caught his eye. At the entrance to the Hendricks Ranch, where the elaborate wooden gate bore the brand of the Double H in carved letters, a wagon stood motionless in the glaring sun. Not the kind of working wagon he was accustomed to seeing. This was a hired conveyance from town, the sort used to transport passengers from the railway station. And beside it, looking as out of place as a hothouse flower in a wheat field, stood a woman. Caleb pulled up on Sadie's reins, his curiosity overcoming his usual inclination to mind his own business. The woman was young, perhaps mid-20s, dressed in traveling clothes that had once been fine but now bore the wrinkles and dust of a long journey. A dark blue dress with modest trim, a small hat pinned to hair the color of autumn wheat that was coming loose from its pins. At her feet sat a leather trunk, its lid hanging open to reveal the scattered contents: clothes, books, what looked like a small wooden box that might have held jewelry. But it was her posture that arrested him. She stood with her spine rigid, one hand pressed against her mouth, the other clutching a piece of paper so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Even from a distance, Caleb could see the tremor in her shoulders, the way she fought to hold herself together against some invisible weight. The wagon driver, a grizzled man Caleb recognized as Tom Whitley, who ran passengers between the train depot and various ranches, sat hunched on his seat with the uncomfortable air of a man who desperately wanted to be anywhere else. His horses stamped and swished their tails against the flies, equally impatient to depart. Caleb's gut twisted with an instinct he couldn't quite name. Something was wrong here. Very wrong. He urged Sadie forward, the mare's hooves raising small clouds of dust as they approached. The woman's head snapped up at the sound, and for the first time Caleb saw her face clearly. She was pretty in an understated way, not the painted beauty of saloon girls or the porcelain perfection of the wealthy women who occasionally passed through town. Her face was honest, with high cheekbones and a straight nose dusted with freckles that spoke of time spent outdoors. But it was her eyes that struck him most, blue-gray like a winter sky, and currently swimming with tears she was too proud to let fall. "Afternoon," Caleb said, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. He kept his voice gentle, the way he might speak to a spooked horse. "Everything all right here?" The woman opened her mouth, closed it, then seemed to gather herself with visible effort. When she spoke, her voice was steadier than he'd expected, though it carried an accent he couldn't quite place. Eastern, educated, but with rough edges that suggested a harder background than her appearance might indicate. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding," she said, and even in those few words, Caleb could hear the careful control, the way she was holding back a torrent of emotion through sheer force of will. "I was told this was the Hendricks Ranch. I was told I would be expected." Tom Whitley shifted on his seat, clearly uncomfortable. "This is the Hendricks place, miss. I brought you right where you paid to go. But Mr. Hendricks, he came out about 20 minutes ago, took one look, and went back inside. Told me to take you back to town." The driver's weathered face creased with sympathy. "I'm real sorry, miss, but I got other folks expecting me. I can't wait around much longer." The woman's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She looked down at the paper in her hand, and Caleb saw her throat work as she swallowed hard. "I understand," she said quietly. Could you give me just a moment?" Something in Caleb's chest tightened. The pieces were falling into place now, painting a picture that made his hands curl into fists. He'd heard rumors over the past few months that Marcus Hendricks had sent away for a mail-order bride, a solution Hendricks had apparently declared at the saloon to his need for someone to manage his household and eventually produce heirs. Caleb had thought it distasteful then. The idea of ordering a woman like you might order a piece of furniture from a catalog. But this was cruelty of a different order entirely. "Ma'am," Caleb said, dismounting from Sadie with a fluid motion born of decades in the saddle. He approached slowly, keeping his movements unthreatening. "I'm Caleb Turner. My ranch borders this one. Can I ask, are you the woman Hendricks sent for?" Her chin came up, and he saw a flash of defiance in those stormy eyes, despite the tears threatening to spill over. "Clara Whitfield. And yes, I am. Or I was supposed to be." She laughed, a bitter sound that had nothing to do with humor. "We corresponded for 4 months. He sent money for my passage from Boston, described his ranch, his life, his hopes for the future. He seemed—" She stopped, shaking her head. "It doesn't matter what he seemed." "What happened?" Caleb asked, though he suspected he already knew. Clara held out the crumpled paper in her hand. After a moment's hesitation, Caleb took it, smoothing out the wrinkles to read the harsh scrawl written there. "Miss Whitfield. I cannot in good conscience proceed with our arrangement. Your appearance does not match the expectations set by your photograph, and I have reason to believe you were not entirely truthful in your correspondence. I will arrange for your return passage to Boston, but I cannot offer you a place in my home. I wish you well in your future endeavors. M. Hendricks." Caleb read it twice, his anger building with each word. The arrogance of it, the casual dismissal, as if this woman were nothing more than a disappointing purchase to be returned to the store. He looked up at Clara, who was watching him with a mixture of embarrassment and defiance. "I was truthful," she said, her voice low but fierce. "Every word I wrote was the truth. The photograph was 2 years old, yes, but it was me. I've lost weight since then. Times have been hard, but I never lied about who I was or where I came from." "I don't doubt it," Caleb said, and he was surprised by the vehemence in his own voice. He handed the letter back to her, resisting the urge to tear it to pieces. "Hendricks is a fool." "Folks," Tom Whitley called down from his perch, his voice apologetic but firm. "I really do need to be moving along. Miss, I can take you back to town, but I need to leave now. The hotel can put you up for the night, and we can sort out your train ticket back east in the morning." Claire's composure finally cracked. Her hand flew to her mouth and a sound escaped her, half sob, half laugh. "The hotel," she repeated. "Yes, of course. The hotel." She turned to her trunk, kneeling beside it to begin gathering the scattered contents with shaking hands. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for the trouble." Caleb watched her try to fold a dress that had come loose, watched her hands fumble with the simple task, watched a tear finally escape and track down her cheek. Something inside him, some long-dormant sense of rightness and justice, made a decision before his rational mind could intervene. "Wait," he said. Clara looked up at him, hope and fear warring in her expression. "How much money do you have?" Caleb asked bluntly. She blinked, clearly taken aback by the question. Mr. Hendricks sent funds for the journey, but those are nearly exhausted. I have perhaps $3 left to my name. Family back east? A shadow crossed her face. No, no family. Job prospects, friends, anywhere to go? Each question seemed to strip away another layer of her composure. No, she whispered. I worked as a seamstress in a factory until it closed. That's why I answered Mr. Hendricks's advertisement. I had nothing left in Boston, nothing but debts and a room I couldn't afford. She laughed again, that same bitter sound. I suppose I'll have to go back anyway and figure something out. Caleb had never considered himself an impulsive man. His life had been built on careful planning, measured decisions, the kind of methodical thinking that kept a ranch running and animals fed. But standing there in the dust and heat, watching this woman try to salvage her dignity along with her scattered belongings, he found himself saying words he'd never imagined speaking. Come with me. Clara's head snapped up. What? Come with me, Caleb repeated, more certain now. To my ranch. I have a spare room. It's nothing fancy, but it's clean and private. You can stay there while you figure out what comes next. No obligations, no expectations, just a roof over your head and time to think. I couldn't possibly, Clara began, but Caleb held up a hand. You could, and you should. Look, I know we're strangers. I know you have no reason to trust me, but you can ask anyone in town. Caleb Turner is a man of his word. I'm offering you a place to stay, nothing more. You keep to yourself if you want, or you help out around the ranch if you prefer. Either way, it's better than burning your last $3 on a hotel room and facing down a trip back east with empty pockets. Tom Whitley was watching this exchange with frank interest, his earlier impatience forgotten. Clara looked between the two men, her mind clearly racing through possibilities and dangers. Why would you do this? She asked finally. You don't know me. Caleb considered the question. Why indeed? He barely understood it himself. But as he looked at her, at the pride in her spine despite the tears on her cheeks, at the strength it must have taken to travel halfway across the country to start a new life, at the courage required to remain standing when that new life had just been crushed before it could begin, he found his answer. Because it's the right thing to do, he said simply. Because Hendricks did you wrong, and somebody ought to make it right. And because, he paused, choosing his words carefully, because nobody should be left standing alone at a gate with nowhere to go. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the stamping of horses and the distant call of a crow. Clara studied his face, and Caleb had the uncomfortable sensation of being thoroughly examined, weighed, and measured by those keen eyes. Finally, she spoke. If I accept it's only temporary, until I can find work, earn enough for passage somewhere, make my own way. I won't be a burden on your charity. Fair enough, Caleb agreed. And I'll work for my keep. I'm a good cook, and I can sew, clean, tend animals. I grew up on a small farm before, She stopped herself. I'm not afraid of hard work. I never thought you were. Clara took a deep breath, seemed to make up her mind, and nodded. Then I accept your offer, Mr. Turner. With gratitude. Caleb, he corrected, if you're going to be staying at my ranch, even temporarily, we might as well be on first-name terms. Clara, she replied, and for the first time since he'd arrived, something like a real smile flickered across her face. It transformed her entirely, chasing away the shadows and revealing a warmth that had been buried beneath fear and humiliation. Tom Whitley cleared his throat. Well, if that's settled, I'll be on my way. Miss Whitfield, Clara, you sure about this? Clara looked at Caleb one more time, then nodded firmly. I'm sure. All right then. Good luck to you both. The driver tipped his hat and clucked to his horses, the wagon lurching into motion and leaving them in a fresh cloud of dust. Caleb moved to help Clara repack her trunk, kneeling beside her in the dirt. Up close, he could see the quality of her belongings, not expensive, but well-made and carefully maintained. Several dresses, all modest and practical. A few books, their spines cracked from repeated reading. A hairbrush with a simple wooden handle. A photograph in a tarnished frame showing a younger Clara with two people who must have been her parents, all three smiling at something outside the frame. I'm sorry, Clara said quietly as they worked. I know this must be incredibly awkward for you, taking in a strange woman, dealing with your neighbors. She stopped, her hand stilling on a folded petticoat. You'll probably face gossip because of this. Caleb shrugged, closing the trunk's lid and latching it securely. Let them talk. Anyone who knows me knows I'm not the type to... He paused, searching for delicate phrasing. I'm offering you a safe place, Clara. Nothing more. Your reputation is your own, and I'll do nothing to compromise it. Thank you, she whispered. Together they secured the trunk to Sadie's saddle. The mare was strong enough to bear the extra weight for the relatively short journey to his ranch. Clara would have to walk, but she nodded when he explained this, gathering her skirts with practical efficiency. As they started down the road, leaving the ornate gates of the Hendricks ranch behind, Caleb found himself acutely aware of the woman walking beside him. She moved with her head high despite everything, her step steady even though she must be exhausted from travel and emotional turmoil. There was steel in her spine, he realized. Whatever had brought her to this point, whatever hardships she'd faced, they hadn't broken her. How long were you standing at that gate? He asked after they'd walked in silence for a few minutes. About an hour, Clara said. Mr. Hendricks came out shortly after the wagon arrived. He looked at me for perhaps 30 seconds, handed me that letter, and went back inside without another word. Tom offered to take me back to town right away, but She trailed off, looking embarrassed. I kept thinking there must be some mistake, that surely he would come back out, explain that there was a misunderstanding. It seemed impossible that someone could be so cruel. Caleb's jaw tightened. Marcus Hendricks is many things, but kind ain't one of them. If it's any consolation, you dodged a bullet. Marriage to that man would have been a misery. And yet I agreed to it, Clara pointed out. What does that say about my judgment? It says you were desperate enough to take a chance on something that looked like hope, Caleb replied. Can't fault anyone for that. They continued in companionable quiet, the only sounds the thud of Sadie's hooves, the creak of leather, and the ever-present whisper of wind through the grass. The sun had begun its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. This was Caleb's favorite time of day, when the harsh light softened and the world seemed to breathe easier. After another mile, Clara spoke again. Tell me about your ranch. If I'm to stay there, even briefly, I should know what I'm walking into. Caleb considered how to describe the Turner place. It's nothing fancy, he began. House is solidly built, 2 bedrooms, a main room that serves as kitchen and sitting area, and a small study my father used for record keeping. Barn's seen better days, but keeps the animals dry. I've got about 24 cattle, 4 horses, including Sadie here, some chickens, and a goat that showed up one day and refused to leave. Despite everything, Clara laughed. A real laugh this time. A squatter goat? Goes by the name of Gertrude, though I can't take credit for that. That was the name on the tag she was wearing when she appeared. Best I can figure, she wandered off from a homestead that went under and decided my barn was preferable to whatever else was on offer. And you just let her stay? Seemed cruel to kick her out. She earns her keep, good milk, and she's better than a dog for warning about coyotes or strangers approaching. As they talked, Caleb found himself relaxing. Clara asked intelligent questions about the ranch operations, the challenges of working the land, the rhythms of the seasons. She didn't pretend to know more than she did, but she clearly had actual experience with farm life, as she'd claimed. When he mentioned the difficulty of keeping predators away from the chickens, she suggested a design for a more secure co-op that showed genuine understanding of the problem. You really did grow up on a farm, he observed. Clara nodded. My father worked a small plot in western Massachusetts. Nothing like the open country out here. Our whole farm would probably fit in one corner of your range. But I learned the basics, how to tend animals, grow vegetables, preserve food for winter. Her expression grew distant. We lost the farm when I was 15. Father died of pneumonia, and mother, she didn't last long after. I went to Boston to live with an aunt who'd married into some money. She got me the factory job, said it was better than being in service. Was it? No, Clara said simply. But it was work, and work meant surviving. I did it for 8 years before the factory closed. My aunt had passed by then, and I had no other family, no prospects, she gestured helplessly. No future I could see. Then I saw Mr. Hendricks' advertisement in a newspaper. Seeking a capable woman of good character for marriage. Must be hard-working and of sound moral fiber. a home and security offered to the right candidate. It seemed like an answer to prayer. And now? Clara looked at him, and in the fading light her eyes were unreadable. Now I'm walking down a dusty road with a stranger, carrying everything I own in a trunk, with no idea what tomorrow holds. I should probably be terrified. Are you? She considered this. No, she said finally. Not of you, anyway. You have an honest face, Caleb Turner, and I'm a good judge of character. Recent evidence to the contrary. The last was said with self-deprecating humor that made him smile. Recent evidence suggests Hendricks is a good actor, Caleb corrected. Takes a particular kind of deception to maintain a 4-month correspondence full of pretty lies.
Sinbad Satat Perrier.
They crested a small rise, and Caleb's ranch came into view below. The sturdy log house nestled in a shallow valley. The barn behind it. The creek that ran along the southern border glinting in the sunset. Smoke rose from the chimney, which was odd until Caleb remembered he'd left a slow fire burning in the stove that morning. The whole scene looked peaceful, solid, real. There it is, he said. The Turner place. Not much to look at, but it's home. Clara stopped walking, her hand rising to shade her eyes as she took in the view. Caleb tried to see it through her eyes, the simple buildings, the rough-hewn fences, the vast emptiness of the surrounding land. After the cities she must have known, the crowds and noise and constant motion, this must seem like the edge of the world. But when she spoke, her voice was soft with something that sounded almost like wonder. It's beautiful. Caleb glanced at her in surprise. Beautiful? All this space, Clara said. All this quiet. All this... She spread her arms, encompassing the endless sky, the rolling grass, the mountains purple with distance on the horizon. Possibility. In Boston, everything was decided already. Every street mapped, every building placed, every life running in its established groove. But this... She turned to him, and her smile was genuine now, touched with the first hint of hope he'd seen. This feels like you could be anyone, become anything, like the world hasn't been written yet. Something in Caleb's chest loosened at those words. He'd always loved this land, but he'd never quite found the language for why. Clara, this stranger from the east who'd been abandoned at a gate just hours ago, had somehow captured it perfectly. Come on, he said gruffly, to cover the unexpected emotion. Let's get you settled before the sun goes down completely. They descended into the valley, Sadie following placidly behind. As they approached the house, Caleb noticed details he usually overlooked. The weeds growing up around the porch posts, the shutter that hung slightly crooked, the general air of masculine neglect that came from a man who lived alone and prioritized function over form. It's a bit rough around the edges, he apologized as he tied Sadie to the hitching post. I don't usually have company. It's fine, Clara assured him, but he caught her eyeing the cluttered porch with an expression that suggested she was mentally cataloging work to be done. Caleb unloaded her trunk, carrying it up the steps with a grunt of effort. It was heavier than it looked. He pushed open the front door, which he rarely bothered locking, and led her inside. The main room was exactly as he'd left it that morning. Breakfast dishes still on the table, his coat thrown over the back of a chair, a saddle he'd been repairing occupying one corner. Books and papers covered every available surface, and dust motes danced in the shaft of sunset light pouring through the western window. The air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and the general mustiness of a house that needed more airing out than it got. Caleb watched Clara take it all in, feeling suddenly self-conscious. How long had it been since anyone other than himself had stood in this room? Years, certainly, and now here was this refined Eastern woman looking at his bachelor's chaos with unreadable eyes. I know it's not much, he started, but Clara interrupted him. It's warm, she said simply. It's shelter. It's more than I had an hour ago. She set down the small bag she'd been carrying and turned to face him squarely. Thank you, Caleb, truly. You didn't have to do this, and I won't forget it. Caleb cleared his throat, uncomfortable with gratitude. Yeah, well, let me show you your room, then I'll see about getting some supper together. He led her through the main room to one of the 2 bedrooms, the smaller one that had been his father's before his death. It held a simple bed with a wooden frame, a dresser with a cracked mirror, a small table with an oil lamp, and a chair by the window. Clean but spare, the room showed no signs of recent habitation. "It's not fancy," Caleb said again, setting her trunk at the foot of the bed. "But the roof doesn't leak, and you'll have privacy. I'll be in the other bedroom, and I'll make sure to knock if I need anything. Door has a lock on the inside if that makes you more comfortable." Clara moved to the window, looking out at the barn and the hills beyond. "It's perfect," she said quietly. Then, turning to face him, "I meant what I said earlier. I'll work for my keep. Tomorrow morning, I'll start earning my place here." "Tomorrow morning, you'll rest," Caleb countered. "You've had a hell of a day. Work can wait."
Rest is a luxury I can't afford right now, Clara said, but there was no heat in it. She looked exhausted, now that he really looked at her. Shadows under those gray-blue eyes, a tension in her shoulders that spoke of burdens carried too long. "But I appreciate the sentiment." Caleb nodded and moved toward the door, then paused. "Clara?" "Yes?" "Whatever Hendricks said in that letter, whatever made him turn you away, he was wrong. You're not disappointing. You're not lacking. He's the one who's deficient, in character if nothing else. I don't want you thinking otherwise." For a moment, Clara looked like she might cry again, but instead she straightened her shoulders and gave him a small, genuine smile. "Thank you, Caleb. I think I needed to hear that." He left her to settle in, closing the door softly behind him. Back in the main room, he stood for a moment, looking at the familiar space and wondering what in the hell he'd just done. 24 hours ago, his life had been simple, predictable, solitary. Now he had a boarder, a female boarder no less, and the knowledge that his quiet routine was about to be thoroughly disrupted. But as he moved to start preparing supper, cleaning off the table and stoking the fire in the stove, Caleb found he didn't regret his impulse. There was something right about having another person in the house, another voice to break the endless silence. And there was something particularly right about it being Clara, this strong, proud woman who'd been dealt a rotten hand but refused to fold. As the light faded outside and lamps were lit within, Caleb found himself humming while he worked, a habit he'd forgotten he had. Through the closed door of the spare room, he could hear the soft sounds of Clara unpacking, settling in, making a space her own. It was just temporary, he reminded himself. She'd made that clear. As soon as she could, she'd move on, find work in town maybe, or save enough to go wherever it was she wanted to go. But for now, for tonight, the Turner Ranch was a little less lonely. And that, Caleb thought as he sliced potatoes for frying, was worth whatever complications might follow. The first light of dawn crept through the window of Clara's room, painting soft gold across the rough wooden floorboards. She'd barely slept, her mind too restless with the upheaval of the previous day, her body too aware of the unfamiliar sounds of this new place, the creak of settling timber, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind that never seemed to cease. But as she lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling beams, she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Safe. It was a fragile sensation, tentative as the morning light, but it was there nonetheless. The door had a lock, just as Caleb had promised. The room was clean and private. And most importantly, the man who'd brought her here had asked nothing of her beyond her name and her story. No leering looks, no inappropriate suggestions, no sense that his charity came with hidden costs. Just quiet decency from a stranger who'd seen someone in need and acted. Clara rose and dressed carefully in her plainest work dress, a faded brown cotton that had seen better days but was sturdy and practical. She pinned her hair back with methodical precision, studying her reflection in the cracked mirror. The woman who looked back at her bore little resemblance to the hopeful bride who'd boarded a train in Boston 3 weeks ago. That woman had been naive, desperate, willing to gamble everything on words written by a stranger. This woman, the one standing in a borrowed room on a Montana ranch, needed to be harder, smarter, more self-reliant. She would not make the mistake of depending on anyone's kindness again. Caleb Turner had given her shelter, and for that she was grateful. But gratitude was not the same as obligation. She would earn her place here honestly, and when she'd saved enough money, somehow, some way, she would move on. Independence was the only safety that truly mattered. Clara opened her door quietly, not wanting to wake Caleb if he was still sleeping, but the main room was already bright with morning sun and bustling with activity. Caleb stood at the stove, his back to her, working a cast-iron skillet over the heat. The smell of frying bacon filled the air, along with coffee so strong she could taste it from across the room. "Morning," Caleb said without turning around. "Hope you slept all right." "Well enough, thank you," Clara replied, smoothing her skirts as she moved into the room. In the daylight, she could see more clearly what she'd only glimpsed the night before. The space was larger than she'd realized, with good bones beneath the clutter. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel crowded with odd objects: rocks, a bird's nest, what looked like a fossilized piece of wood. The furniture was handmade but solid, built to last rather than to impress. Books overflowed from a shelf near the window, their spines cracked and pages dog-eared from repeated reading. It was a room that had been lived in, worked in, but not cared for in the way a woman might care for it. Not neglected exactly, but overlooked, as if the person who inhabited it had more important things on his mind than dust or organization. "I hope you don't mind," Caleb continued, sliding bacon onto a plate, "but I took the liberty of making breakfast. Figured you'd be hungry after yesterday." "I don't mind at all," Clara said, "though I did promise to earn my keep. You shouldn't be waiting on me." Caleb finally turned to face her, and in the morning light, Clara saw him properly for the first time. He was tall and lean, built with the wiry strength of someone who performed hard physical labor daily. His face was weathered, lined at the eyes and mouth in a way that suggested he smiled more often than he frowned, though his expression now was serious, assessing. Dark hair touched with gray at the temples, despite what she guessed was only early 30s. Eyes the color of strong coffee, steady and direct. He was, she realized with a small start, handsome in an unpolished way. Not like the clean-shaven men of Boston with their pomaded hair and soft hands, but attractive nonetheless. The thought made her uncomfortable, so she pushed it aside firmly. "We can talk about earning keep after you've had some food," Caleb said, gesturing to the table, which he'd cleared of the previous day's clutter. 2 plates waited there, along with cups for coffee. "Sit, eat, then we'll figure out how things are going to work around here." Clara wanted to argue, to assert her independence immediately, but her stomach betrayed her with an audible growl. She hadn't eaten since a stale biscuit on the train yesterday morning. Swallowing her pride, she sat. Caleb brought the plates over, bacon, fried eggs, thick slices of bread toasted over the fire. Simple food, but well prepared and generous. He poured coffee into her cup, and she wrapped her hands around it gratefully, inhaling the rich steam. They ate in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the clink of cutlery against plates and the morning chorus of birds outside. Clara found herself studying Caleb surreptitiously between bites. He ate with the efficient manner of someone who viewed meals as fuel rather than social occasions, but there was nothing crude about his table manners. He'd been raised right, she could tell, taught proper behavior even if he didn't always bother with formalities when alone. "This is very good," Clara said finally. "Thank you," Caleb shrugged. "Basic cooking. Nothing fancy. Better than what I could make in my boarding house room. I had a single hot plate and 3 square feet of space." She took another bite of egg, surprised by how hungry she actually was. "This is luxury by comparison." "Tell me about Boston," Caleb said suddenly. "What was it like? I've never been further east than Chicago." Clara considered how to answer, how much to reveal. But something about the quiet of the morning, the sense of safety she'd woken with, made her more forthcoming than she might otherwise have been. "Crowded," she said. "That's the first word that comes to mind. Thousands of people packed into buildings, packed into streets. Everyone rushing somewhere. Always noise, always movement. The factory where I worked was on the 4th floor of a building that should have only held 2 floors worth of machinery. We worked 12-hour shifts 6 days a week, making shirts for people who would never know our names or care about our lives." "Sounds grim," Caleb observed. "It was," Clara agreed, "but it was also alive, in a way. There was culture, theaters, libraries, lectures. If you had money, you could see and do almost anything. I didn't have money, of course, but sometimes I'd walk past the opera house or the museum and imagine what it would be like to go inside." "Did you ever?" "Once. The library offered free concerts on Sunday afternoons. I went to hear a string quartet perform Mozart." Clara smiled at the memory. "It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard.
For 1 hour, I wasn't a factory girl with worn-out shoes and perpetually stained fingers. I was just someone listening to music. Caleb refilled her coffee cup. We don't have much culture out here. Occasionally a traveling show comes through town, musicians, actors, that sort of thing. Mostly it's just work and weather and trying to survive. And yet you stay, Clara observed. You could go east, find city work. You're clearly educated. She nodded toward the overflowing bookshelf. You could probably do well in business or law or any number of professions. Could, Caleb acknowledged, but I'd hate every minute of it. This land... He paused, searching for words. It's in my blood, I guess. My grandfather came out here in the 40s, staked a claim, built something from nothing. My father expanded it, made it work despite droughts and harsh winters and all the thousand things that can go wrong. When he died, leaving it felt like betraying everything they'd built, everything they'd sacrificed. So you sacrificed yourself instead, Clara said quietly. Caleb's eyes sharpened. I wouldn't call it sacrifice. This is the life I chose. But did you? Choose it, I mean. Or did you just inherit it and convince yourself it was a choice? The words hung between them, perhaps too bold, too familiar for two people who'd known each other less than a day. Clara half expected Caleb to take offense, to remind her she was a guest, and guests didn't question their hosts. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and regarded her with something like respect. You're perceptive, he said finally. And maybe you're right. Maybe I didn't choose this so much as accept it. But here's the thing. Even if it started as obligation, it became something more. This ranch, this land, it's mine in a way nothing else ever could be. I know every creek bed, every stand of trees, every place where the grass grows thick and where it thins out. I've delivered calves in the spring and hunted elk in the fall. I've survived blizzards that should have killed me and droughts that nearly bankrupted me. And through it all, I've been free. Free, Clara repeated, tasting the word. Is anyone truly free? Freer than most, Caleb countered. I answer to no boss, keep no schedule, but the one nature sets. If I want to spend a day reading instead of working, I can. If I want to ride out to the far pasture just to watch the sunset, there's nobody to tell me no. That's freedom, or as close to it as most folks ever get. Clara thought about her own life. The factory bells that had dictated every moment of her day, the boarding house rules that had governed her evenings, the constant grinding pressure of bills and debts and obligations, the desperate gamble she'd made on Marcus Hendricks's promises because she'd seen no other path to something better. I think, she said slowly, that I've never been free a day in my life. Well, Caleb said, pushing back from the table and collecting the empty plates, maybe that changes now. They washed dishes together in companionable silence, Clara insisting on helping despite Caleb's protests. The routine felt oddly natural, as if they'd performed this domestic dance many times before. When the last plate was dried and put away, Caleb turned to her with a more businesslike expression. Right. So, about the arrangement. I meant what I said yesterday. You're welcome to stay as long as you need, but I understand you wanting to contribute. Here's what I'm thinking. You handle the cooking and general housekeeping. I can cook enough to keep from starving, but I'll be the first to admit this place could use a woman's touch. He gestured at the cluttered room. In exchange, you get room and board. No questions asked. When you're ready to move on, you move on. No hard feelings, no obligations beyond the day-to-day. That's too generous, Clara protested. Cooking and cleaning aren't enough to justify... There's more, Caleb interrupted. If you're willing, I could use help with the animals, feeding chickens, collecting eggs, milking Gertrude. Basic ranch work, nothing too strenuous. And if you meant what you said about being good with a needle, I've got about a dozen shirts that need mending and pants with holes in places I'd rather not discuss. Despite herself, Clara smiled. I can manage all of that, but it still seems like you're getting the short end of the arrangement. Let me be the judge of that, Caleb said firmly. Look, Clara, I'm not doing this out of pure charity. Truth is, having help around here will make my life easier, and having someone to talk to... He trailed off, looking slightly embarrassed. Well, it's been a long time since I had regular conversation. Gets lonely out here sometimes. The admission surprised her with its honesty. Most men she'd known would rather die than admit to loneliness, viewing it as a weakness to be hidden rather than a human need to be acknowledged.
Then we have an agreement, Clara said, extending her hand formally. Room and board in exchange for household management and basic ranch assistance, for as long as the arrangement suits us both. Caleb shook her hand, his grip firm but careful. Deal. Now, how about I show you around, introduce you to the animals, explain the daily routine, all that? For the next 2 hours, Caleb led Clara through the ranch, explaining as they went. The barn first, where 4 horses regarded her with liquid eyes from their stalls. There was Sadie, the steady mare who'd carried Clara's trunk yesterday, a gelding named Charlie, who Caleb used for herding cattle, and 2 younger horses still in training, siblings named Jack and Jill, with matching white blazes on their foreheads. Can you ride? Caleb asked as Clara stroked Sadie's velvet nose. I could once, years ago. I'm probably rusty. We'll fix that if you're interested. Being able to ride makes everything easier out here. Distances are too great for walking everywhere. They moved on to the chicken coop where a dozen hens scratched and pecked at the dirt. Caleb explained the feeding schedule, showed her where the grain was kept, demonstrated how to check for eggs without getting pecked by the more aggressive birds. That one's Henrietta, he said, pointing to a particularly large brown hen. She's the boss of the flock and she knows it. Don't let her bully you. She'll take advantage if you show any fear. As if to prove the point, Henrietta fixed Clara with a beady eye and made a low, threatening sound in her throat. I face down factory foreman, Clara told the hen calmly. You don't scare me. Caleb laughed, a sound that transformed his usually serious face. I think you're going to get along just fine. The infamous Gertrude waited in a small shed attached to the barn, a black and white goat with intelligent eyes and an attitude that suggested she considered humans barely tolerable. She tolerated Clara's introduction with the air of a queen granting an audience to a peasant. She's particular, Caleb warned. Doesn't like anyone touching her except during milking time, and even then she's liable to kick if you're not paying attention. But she gives good milk, and like I said, she's better than a watchdog for raising alarm. They walked the perimeter of the immediate ranch area, Caleb pointing out landmarks and explaining boundaries. The creek that provided water, running clear and cold from the mountains. The vegetable garden, currently neglected and overrun with weeds. The woodpile that needed replenishing before winter. The far pastures where the cattle grazed, visible as dark spots against the golden grass. Clara absorbed it all, her practical mind already cataloging tasks and possibilities. The garden could be salvaged. It wasn't too late in the season to get a decent harvest of root vegetables and late greens. The house needed a thorough cleaning, but the structure was sound. The chicken coop could be improved with some minor repairs that would make egg collection easier and safer. There was work here, honest work, the kind that produced tangible results. It's a lot, Caleb said as they stood looking out over the land. I know it probably seems overwhelming, but you don't have to do everything at once. Take your time, figure out your own routine. I'm not overwhelmed, Clara said. I'm grateful. For the first time in years, I can see a purpose to my days beyond just surviving until the next day. They headed back toward the house, walking side by side through the tall grass. The sun had climbed higher, burning off the last of the morning coolness and promising another hot afternoon. Insects hummed in the air, and somewhere a hawk called out, circling on thermal currents invisible to human eyes. Can I ask you something? Clara said as they approached the porch. Sure. Yesterday, you said nobody should be left standing alone at a gate with nowhere to go. It seemed like maybe you weren't just talking about me. Like maybe you've been there yourself in some way. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as if chewing on whether to answer. Finally, he spoke. After my father died, there was a woman, Elizabeth. We'd been courting for about a year, had an understanding that we'd marry. She was the daughter of one of the big ranchers, educated back east, pretty as a picture. I thought she loved me, and I know I loved her. He paused, staring out at the horizon. But after the funeral, when it became clear just how much debt my father had left, how precarious the ranch's finances were, Elizabeth's father put an end to things. Said he wouldn't see his daughter tied to a failing operation. She didn't fight him on it, just handed me back the ring I'd given her and married a banker from Denver 6 months later. I'm sorry, Clara said quietly. It was 7 years ago. I got over it. But the way he said it suggested that wasn't entirely true.
But standing there yesterday, watching you hold that rejection letter from Hendricks, I remembered what it felt like. To be judged and found wanting. To have someone look at you and decide you're not enough. He turned to face her. I wouldn't wish that feeling on anyone. Clara felt something shift in her chest, a softening toward this man who'd saved her from humiliation and desperation. Not attraction exactly, or if it was, she refused to examine it too closely, but a deeper understanding. They were both wounded in their way, both carrying scars that hadn't fully healed. Thank you for telling me that, she said. And for the record, Elizabeth's loss was your gain. Anyone who values money over character isn't worth having. Caleb smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. Funny, that's almost exactly what my father would have said. They spent the rest of the morning working together. Caleb had cattle to check on in the far pasture, so Clara tackled the house, starting with the main room. She opened all the windows to let fresh air sweep through, then began the process of organizing the chaos into something resembling order. Books went on shelves, papers into neat stacks, dishes to their proper places. She found a broom in a closet and swept the floors, then attacked the dust that had settled on every surface. As she worked, she found herself humming, old songs her mother had taught her, melodies that had been buried beneath years of factory noise and city clamor. The physical labor felt good, purposeful in a way that factory work had never been. There, she'd been a cog in a machine producing products she'd never use for people she'd never meet. Here, every clean surface and organized shelf directly improved her immediate environment. The results were visible, satisfying. She was scrubbing the table when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Through the window, she saw Caleb returning on Charlie, the horse's coat dark with sweat. He dismounted with fluid ease and led the gelding to the barn, moving with the natural grace of someone who'd spent a lifetime in the saddle. Clara turned back to her work, but she found her thoughts drifting to her employer, if that was even the right word for what Caleb was. He'd said this wasn't charity, that he was getting something out of the arrangement too, but Clara couldn't quite believe that. The work she was doing, while helpful, hardly seemed equivalent to room, board, and sanctuary, which meant he was either lying about his motivations or genuinely didn't realize how much more he was giving than receiving. She suspected the latter. There was a straightforwardness about Caleb that suggested he wasn't capable of much deception. He said what he meant and meant what he said, a refreshing quality in a world where Clara had learned to distrust pretty words and promises. "Good Lord," Caleb said from the doorway, pulling her from her thoughts. "Did you clean or perform magic? I barely recognized the place." Clara straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "Just basic housekeeping, though I'd argue it had been neglected long enough to qualify as advanced housekeeping." Fair point. Caleb hung his hat on a peg by the door and surveyed the transformed room. "Looks good. Really good. Makes me realize how much I'd let things go." "It happens when you're managing everything alone," Clara said. "You prioritize what's necessary for survival and let everything else slide." "I did the same in my boarding house room." Caleb moved to the water bucket, ladled out a drink, and downed it in one long swallow. "I checked the cattle. Everything's fine out there, but I noticed some fence damage on the western boundary. I'll need to spend tomorrow repairing it before we lose any stock." "Is that dangerous? The repair work, I mean." "Can be. Bulls don't always appreciate you messing with their territory, but it's necessary." An idea formed in Clara's mind, bold and probably foolish, but she spoke before she could talk herself out of it. "Could you teach me?" "How to mend fences, I mean. I want to learn ranch work, real ranch work, not just the domestic tasks." Caleb raised his eyebrows. "It's hard labor, hot, dirty, and sometimes dangerous." So was the factory, except it paid worse and offered no room for advancement. Clara met his gaze steadily. "I'm stronger than I look, and I learn quickly. If I'm going to be here, even temporarily, I might as well learn skills that could be useful elsewhere." "Elsewhere?" Caleb repeated. "You thinking of becoming a rancher?" "I'm thinking of keeping my options open. Who knows? Maybe I'll move on and find work on another ranch. Or maybe I'll end up somewhere that these skills prove useful in ways I can't predict. Point is, I'd rather learn than stay ignorant." Caleb studied her for a long moment, and Clara had the sense she was being tested somehow. Finally, he nodded. "All right. Tomorrow, you come with me to mend fence. But you follow my instructions exactly. especially around the cattle. Agreed? Agreed. Good. Now what's for lunch? All this discussion of hard labor has made me hungry. They ate simple fare: bread, cheese, and apples from a barrel in the cellar that was miraculously still good. Caleb explained the basics of food preservation and storage for the winter months, a topic that led to a broader discussion of seasonal rhythms and the constant planning required to run a successful ranch. You're always thinking 6 months ahead, he explained. What you do in spring affects summer. What you do in summer determines how you survive winter. It's like a giant puzzle that never quite solves because the pieces keep changing. But you like it, Clara observed. The challenge. I do, Caleb admitted, probably more than is healthy. My father used to say I was married to the land. Guess he was right. After lunch, Clara declared her intention to tackle the neglected vegetable garden. Caleb showed her where the tools were kept and gave her a basic primer on what might still be salvageable this late in the season. Potatoes should still be good underground if they were planted early, he said, kneeling beside her in the weed-choked plot. Carrots, too. And you could get a crop of turnips and beets in before the first frost if you plant soon. Tomatoes are probably a lost cause at this point, but there might be some late beans worth harvesting. They worked together in the garden for the next few hours, pulling weeds, loosening soil, uncovering vegetables that had survived beneath the neglect. It was hot, sweaty work that left dirt under Clara's nails and a satisfying ache in her muscles. She found herself enjoying it immensely, the simple physicality of it, the way each cleared row revealed new possibilities. As they worked, they talked. Caleb told stories about the ranch, about his father's stubbornness, and his grandfather's legendary ability to predict weather. Clara shared carefully edited versions of her own history: the farm she'd grown up on, the aunt who'd helped her after her parents died, the years in Boston that she summarized without dwelling on the hardest parts. She didn't tell him about the man at the factory who'd promised to marry her if she'd lend him money for a business venture. Didn't mention how she'd scraped together her meager savings and given it to him, only to watch him disappear with the funds and another girl. Didn't talk about the landlady who'd threatened eviction when Clara was 3 weeks behind on rent, or the night she'd gone to bed hungry because food meant choosing between eating and keeping a roof over her head. Some wounds were still too fresh to share with anyone, even someone as seemingly trustworthy as Caleb Turner. The sun was sinking toward the horizon when they finally finished with the garden. Clara stood, stretching her back and surveying their work with satisfaction. What had been a weedy mess that morning was now neat rows of cleared earth, ready for planting. They'd harvested 24 potatoes, a bushel of carrots, and enough beans to make several meals. "You're good at this," Caleb observed, wiping sweat from his brow. "The garden looks better than it has in 2 years." "It's not so different from the small plot we had in Massachusetts," Clara said. "My mother used to say that dirt doesn't care whether you're rich or poor. It responds to honest work either way." "Wise woman, your mother." She was. Clara felt the familiar pang of loss, muted now by years but never entirely gone. "I wish I'd appreciated her more when I had the chance." They walked back to the house in the golden light of late afternoon, their shadows stretching long across the grass. Inside, Clara insisted on cooking supper, shooing Caleb away when he tried to help. She'd seen the basics of his pantry and found enough to work with: salt pork, onions from the cellar, the vegetables they'd just harvested, flour for biscuits. As she cooked, moving around the kitchen with increasing confidence, Caleb sat at the table supposedly working on ranch accounts, but mostly just watching her work. Clara found it oddly comfortable, this domestic scene. For so long, she'd been alone in cramped rooms, eating solitary meals, existing in a bubble of isolation even when surrounded by crowds. But this, cooking for someone else, hearing another person's presence in the house, felt natural in a way she hadn't expected. "You really can cook," Caleb said when she finally set plates on the table. The simple meal looked almost elegant the way she'd arranged it, with biscuits golden and steaming beside the vegetables and meat. "I told you I could," Claire replied, taking her seat. "Did you doubt me?" "Not doubt exactly, but there's a difference between competent cooking and good cooking. This is good cooking." They ate as the last light faded from the sky, talking easily now after a full day of working together. The conversation ranged from practical matters, tasks for the coming days, supplies that needed purchasing in town, to more philosophical topics. Caleb asked about Clara's reading habits, and they discovered a shared love of adventure novels and poetry. I have a collection of Whitman in my room, Caleb said. Leaves of Grass. My father thought it was scandalous, but I've read it cover to cover at least a dozen times. I celebrate myself and sing myself, Clara quoted. And what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. Caleb's face lit with surprised pleasure. You know Whitman? The factory girls weren't all illiterate, Clara said with gentle reproach. We had a lending library, borrowed books from each other. I read everything I could get my hands on. Shakespeare, Dickens, Emerson, Thoreau. Books were windows into lives beyond the factory floor. I never meant to suggest, Caleb started, but Clara waved him off. I know. Most people make assumptions about factory workers. It's easier to see us as machines than as people with minds and dreams. They finished the meal and cleaned up together, falling into an easy rhythm that was becoming familiar. As Clara hung the drying cloth on its hook, she realized with a start that this was only her second night at the Turner Ranch. Somehow, it felt like much longer. The sharp edges of yesterday's humiliation and fear had been softened by honest work and genuine companionship. Thank you, she said suddenly. For today. For all of it. Caleb looked up from the table where he was tallying figures in a worn ledger. You did most of the work. I should be thanking you. That's not what I meant. I meant thank you for treating me like a person, not a charity case. For giving me work that matters. For talking to me like an equal. After yesterday, after Hendricks, she paused, choosing her words. I needed to remember that not everyone sees me as disposable. Something shifted in Caleb's expression, a softness that made him look younger. Clara, I don't know what your life was like before you came here, and I won't pry, but I can tell you've been hurt, been undervalued. That ends now. While you're under this roof, you're not disposable or inferior or any of the other things people might have made you feel. You're just Clara, and Clara is clearly capable, intelligent, and deserving of respect. Don't let anyone, including yourself, convince you otherwise. The words hit Clara with unexpected force, and she felt tears threatening. She blinked them back fiercely, refusing to cry in front of this man who'd already seen her at her lowest. Thank you, she managed. You're welcome. Now I'm going to take a walk before bed. Need to check that the barn's secured for the night. You get some rest. Tomorrow's fence mending, and it's going to be a long day. After he left, Clara stood in the quiet house, listening to the sounds of the Montana night filtering through the walls. Somewhere an owl called, its voice carrying across the darkness. The wind whispered through the grass with a sound like the ocean, though Clara had never seen an ocean to know if the comparison was accurate. She moved to the window and looked out at the star-scattered sky, vast and brilliant in a way city skies never were. Out there in the darkness, Caleb moved from house to barn, checking on animals and securing doors, performing the nightly rituals that kept this small world functioning. And in here, in this sturdy house, with its clean floors and organized shelves, Clara felt something she'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. It was tentative still, fragile as new ice on a winter pond. But it was there, warming her chest and loosening the tight knot of anxiety that had lived in her gut for longer than she cared to remember. Maybe, just maybe, she would be all right. Maybe this temporary refuge would give her time to heal, to plan, to become the person she was meant to be rather than the person circumstances had forced her to be. She thought about the garden they'd cleared today, the neat rows of earth waiting for new seeds. That's what she was, cleared ground, ready for planting. What would grow there remained to be seen, but for the first time in years she was genuinely curious about the answer. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that felt both surprising and inevitable. Clara woke each morning before dawn, moving quietly through the house to start coffee and prepare breakfast while Caleb tended to the animals. They'd eat together as the sun climbed over the eastern hills, discussing the day's tasks with the easy familiarity of people who'd worked together for years rather than weeks. Then they'd separate to their respective duties, Caleb to the cattle and horses, Clara to the house and garden, before reuniting for lunch and whatever afternoon projects required two pairs of hands. True to his word, Caleb taught her ranch work.
That first day of fence mending had been brutal. They'd ridden out together, Clara on the gentle Sadie, while Caleb led a pack horse loaded with tools and supplies. The western fence line ran for miles across rolling terrain, and the damaged section Caleb had spotted turned out to be nearly 100 yards of posts that had rotted at the base and wire that had rusted through in multiple places. Clara had watched carefully as Caleb demonstrated the proper technique for digging out old posts and setting new ones, for stretching wire tight enough to be secure but not so tight it would snap in winter cold, for fastening everything so it would hold against the pressure of curious cattle in harsh weather. Then he'd handed her the tools and told her to try. Her first attempt had been clumsy, the post crooked and the wire slack, but Caleb had simply nodded and said, "Again," without criticism or impatience. She'd tried again and again until her hands blistered and her shoulders screamed and the sun beat down on her neck with merciless intensity. But by mid-afternoon, she'd set 3 posts that Caleb declared would hold, and the small surge of pride she felt at his approval was worth every ache. They'd worked that fence line for 3 full days before declaring it finished. Clara's hands had bled, her muscles had protested every movement, and she'd collapsed into bed each night too exhausted even to read. But she'd learned. The next time they'd had to repair fence, a section damaged by a fallen tree during a summer storm, she'd worked with confidence and skill, and Caleb had complimented her technique. He taught her other things too. How to read the sky for weather, watching for the particular quality of clouds that meant rain or the clear, brittle look that preceded a cold snap. How to move among the cattle without spooking them, using calm movements and a firm voice. How to check a horse's hooves for stones or signs of injury. How to saddle and bridle properly. How to sit a trot without bouncing and a canter without losing her seat. Clara absorbed it all with the fierce determination of someone who'd spent too many years powerless over her own fate. Every new skill was another tool in her arsenal, another way to ensure she'd never be completely dependent on anyone else's charity or goodwill. If she had to leave the Turner Ranch tomorrow, she wanted to leave knowing she could find work, could make herself useful, could survive. But as the days stretched into weeks, the urgency of that need began to fade. Not because she'd become complacent, but because something else was happening, something she hadn't anticipated and wasn't entirely sure how to navigate. She was beginning to feel at home. It manifested in small ways at first. The way she knew without thinking where Caleb kept the coffee, which floorboard creaked loudest, how much wood to add to the stove to maintain the perfect cooking temperature. The way she caught herself thinking of tasks in terms of we and our rather than I and his. The way she'd started leaving her bedroom door open at night, comforted by the sounds of another person moving through the house rather than feeling vulnerable to their presence. The house itself had been transformed under her care. She'd sewn curtains from fabric Caleb had driven her to town to purchase, simple cotton in a pale blue that caught the morning light and made the main room feel larger and airier. She'd organized his chaotic collection of books into some semblance of order, grouping them by subject and author in a way that made finding specific volumes actually possible. She'd scrubbed every surface, mended every piece of clothing that needed it, and established routines for cleaning and maintenance that kept the house from sliding back into bachelor neglect. The garden flourished under her attention. She'd planted late-season vegetables that were now producing bountifully, turnips and beets and hardy greens that would last well into fall. She'd found wild berry bushes along the creek and harvested enough fruit to make preserves, lining them up on a shelf in the cellar with labels written in her neat hand. She'd even coaxed the scraggly rose bush beside the front porch back to life, pruning away dead wood and fertilizing the soil until it produced a handful of deep red blooms that scented the evening air. Caleb had noticed the changes, commenting on them with genuine appreciation that never felt patronizing. He'd taken to bringing her small gifts from his trips to town, a new gardening trowel when he noticed her old one breaking, a book of poetry he thought she'd enjoy, a hair ribbon in a color that matched her eyes. Nothing expensive or inappropriate, just small tokens that said he saw her, noticed her preferences, valued her presence. And Clara, despite her best intentions to remain emotionally detached, found herself looking forward to these gestures more than she cared to admit. Found herself watching for Caleb's return when he rode out to check the far pastures, listening for the sound of his voice calling out to the horses. Found herself noticing details about him she had no business noticing. the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the strength in his hands when he helped her lift something heavy, the rare but genuine laugh that transformed his usually serious face. It was dangerous territory, this growing attachment. Clara knew that, reminded herself of it constantly. She'd come to Montana looking for security in the form of marriage to Marcus Hendricks, and that had been a disaster. She'd promised herself she wouldn't make the mistake of depending on a man again, of letting her heart lead her into situations her head knew were risky. Caleb had offered her temporary refuge, nothing more, and reading anything else into his kindness would be foolish at best and devastating at worst. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally were two different things, Clara was discovering, and her emotions were becoming increasingly difficult to control. The turning point came on a Saturday in late August. Caleb had mentioned the previous evening that he needed to ride into town for supplies and suggested Clara might want to come along. She'd been at the ranch for 6 weeks by then, but hadn't left the property once, content to remain in her small, safe world. The thought of facing townspeople, of answering questions about who she was and why she was staying with Caleb Turner filled her with anxiety she couldn't quite articulate. But Caleb had been so casual about the invitation, so clearly unconcerned about what anyone might think, that Clara had found herself agreeing. She'd need fabric soon if she was going to make herself a new dress. The few she'd brought were wearing thin from daily hard work, and it seemed cowardly to hide indefinitely. They'd set out early, the wagon loaded with eggs and vegetables Clara had prepared to sell or trade. The ride to town took nearly 2 hours, following a road that wound through increasingly populated country. They passed other ranches, some prosperous with painted houses and well-maintained outbuildings, others clearly struggling with sagging fences and overgrown fields. Caleb knew them all, nodding or calling out greetings to the people they passed, introducing Clara simply as my friend Miss Whitfield, who's staying at the ranch. The town itself was larger than Clara had expected, a bustling community of perhaps 300 permanent residents, plus the constant flow of travelers, cowboys, and prospectors passing through. Main Street featured a general store, a hotel, a church, 2 saloons, a bank, a doctor's office, and various other businesses that spoke to a town trying hard to become more than just a frontier outpost. Caleb pulled the wagon up in front of the general store, a substantial building with a false front and large windows displaying an impressive array of goods. I'll handle the business transactions if you want to look around, he offered, climbing down and offering Clara his hand to help her descend. Clara took his hand, feeling the calloused warmth of his palm against hers, and stepped down onto the boardwalk. Immediately, she felt eyes on her, people walking past casting curious glances. A group of women outside the hotel pausing their conversation to stare openly. She raised her chin, refusing to show discomfort. Inside the store, the proprietor, a balding man in his 50s with shrewd eyes and a friendly manner, greeted Caleb warmly. "Turner, haven't seen you in a month. Thought maybe you'd decided to become a hermit permanently." "Just been busy, George. Good harvest this year, lots to keep me occupied," Caleb gestured to Clara. "This is Miss Clara Whitfield. She's staying at my ranch, helping me get the place in order." George's eyebrows rose slightly, but his smile remained professional. "Miss Whitfield, welcome to Helena. I'm George Morrison, and this is my store. If you need anything at all, you just let me know." "Thank you, Mr. Morrison," Clara said, matching his businesslike tone. "I'll need fabric, thread, and some basic sewing supplies if you have them. Over on the left side, 3rd shelf back. My wife keeps that section stocked. She's in the back room right now, but I'll fetch her if you need help with anything." Clara moved through the store, aware of Caleb and George negotiating prices for the eggs and vegetables she'd brought, aware too of other customers who'd entered and were watching her with barely concealed curiosity. She focused on examining fabric, running her hands over different bolts and considering what would be most practical for ranch work. "You're the mail-order bride that Hendricks rejected." The voice came from behind her, female and sharp, with barely concealed glee. Clara turned to find 3 women regarding her with expressions ranging from pity to predatory interest. They were well dressed by frontier standards, their clothes suggesting they were wives of successful men, women with enough leisure time to spend their mornings shopping and gossiping. "I was engaged to Mr. Hendricks." "Yes," Clara said evenly, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. "The engagement was dissolved by mutual agreement." Mutual agreement, one of the women repeated with a laugh that had nothing kind in it. That's a charitable interpretation. I heard he took one look at you and sent you packing. Margaret, that's unkind, the oldest of the three said, though her tone suggested she was enjoying the confrontation as much as her friend. I'm sure Miss Whitfield, was it? I'm sure Miss Whitfield did her best. Clara felt heat rising in her cheeks but kept her voice steady. If you'll excuse me, ladies, I have shopping to complete. Of course, dear. Though I must say, moving directly from Hendrick's place to Turner's ranch seems rather convenient. I do hope you're not taking advantage of that poor man's kind nature. The implication was clear, and it took every ounce of Clara's self-control not to respond. She turned back to the fabric, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to focus on colors and textures while the women continued their whispered commentary behind her. I heard she was a factory girl from back east. Probably thought any man with land would do. Poor Turner. He always was too soft-hearted for his own good. Mark my words, she'll have her hooks in him before winter. Men like that, living alone so long, they're easy prey for a clever woman. Clara's vision blurred with angry tears she refused to let fall. She'd known there would be gossip, had prepared herself for it, but hearing the casual cruelty of these women's judgments was harder than she'd anticipated. Every fear she'd harbored about her situation, every doubt about whether Caleb's generosity would be misinterpreted, was being confirmed in ugly whispers that weren't even trying to be subtle. "Excuse me, ladies." Caleb's voice cut through the women's commentary like a knife. Clara turned to see him standing behind the gossiping trio, his expression pleasant, but his eyes hard as flint. "I couldn't help overhearing your conversation, and I wanted to clear up any misunderstandings." The women had the grace to look uncomfortable. The one called Margaret attempted a smile. "Oh, Mr. Turner, we were just making Miss Whitfield's acquaintance." "By suggesting she's an opportunist taking advantage of me?" Caleb's tone remained conversational, but there was steel underneath. "That's an interesting way to make someone feel welcome." "We meant no offense," the oldest woman said quickly. "We were simply concerned for your reputation." "My reputation is my own concern, Mrs. Whitfield. And Miss Whitfield's character is above reproach. She's a guest at my ranch, working as my housekeeper in exchange for room and board. It's a perfectly respectable arrangement, and anyone who suggests otherwise is speaking from ignorance and malice." The silence that followed was profound. Other customers in the store had stopped their shopping to listen, and Clara could feel the weight of their attention. She wanted to disappear, to sink through the floorboards and never face these people again. But Caleb wasn't finished. He turned to address the broader audience, his voice carrying to every corner of the store. "For anyone else who might be curious or inclined to gossip, let me be clear. Clara Whitfield is under my protection. She's earned her place at my ranch through hard work and good character. Anyone who disrespects her disrespects me. I trust that's understood." The declaration hung in the air, impossible to misinterpret. Caleb was publicly claiming Clara as someone worthy of respect, someone whose honor he would defend. It was a bold statement in a community where reputation meant everything, and Clara felt a complex swirl of emotions, gratitude, embarrassment, something warmer she didn't want to name. George Morrison broke the tension with a hearty laugh. "Well said, Turner. Now, ladies, if you're finished with your shopping, I have other customers to attend to. Miss Whitfield, did you find the fabric you needed?" Clara managed to nod and complete her purchases with hands that shook only slightly. Caleb stayed close as they finished their business, his presence a silent declaration that he meant what he'd said. When they finally left the store, Clara was aware of the stares that followed them down the boardwalk, the whispered conversations that started as soon as they passed. "I'm sorry," Caleb said once they were seated in the wagon and heading out of town. "I should have warned you it might be rough. Small towns thrive on gossip, and your situation with Hendricks gave them plenty to talk about." "You didn't have to defend me like that," Clara said quietly. "It only made things worse. Now they'll really believe there's something inappropriate happening." "Let them believe what they want. The truth is simpler and less interesting than their gossip." Caleb glanced at her, his expression softening. "You all right?" Clara wanted to say yes, to brush off the incident and prove she was strong enough to handle a few malicious comments, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself speaking a deeper truth. "Those women said what everyone's thinking, that I'm taking advantage of your kindness.
that I'm trying to trap you into something you don't want. And maybe they're right. Maybe I should have moved on by now, found work in town, stopped imposing on your hospitality. Stop. Caleb pulled the wagon to a halt, turning to face her fully. First, you're not imposing. I asked you to stay. Second, you've more than earned your keep. The ranch runs smoother than it has in years, and that's entirely because of your work. And third, he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. What those women think doesn't matter. What matters is that you have a place that's safe, work that's honest, and time to figure out what comes next. Don't let their small-minded cruelty chase you away from that. But your reputation is mine to worry about. Clara, I'm 32 years old. I own my land outright, answer to no one, and frankly, don't give a damn what the church ladies think of my household arrangements. If having you at the ranch costs me some social standing, that's a price I'm willing to pay. Clara studied his face, searching for any sign that he was saying what he thought she wanted to hear rather than what he truly believed. But Caleb's expression was open, honest, the same straightforward sincerity that had characterized every interaction they'd had. Why? She asked softly. Why does it matter so much to you? I'm just a stranger you found at a gate. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the horizon where clouds were building in dramatic towers. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he wasn't quite managing to conceal. When I found you that day, standing there with that letter in your hand and nowhere to go, it was like looking at myself 7 years ago. After Elizabeth left, after I realized the woman I'd loved had been more interested in my prospects than in me, I felt disposable. Like I'd been weighed, measured, and found wanting. It's a feeling that hollows you out, makes you question everything about yourself. He turned back to Clara, and she was startled to see the raw honesty in his eyes. I couldn't leave you there feeling that way. And once you came to the ranch, once I got to know you, I realized Hendricks wasn't just a fool, he was a criminal. Because you, Clara Whitfield, are anything but disposable. You're smart, capable, hardworking, and kind. You've taken a house that was barely livable and made it a home. You've learned ranch work that grown men struggle with. You faced down gossip and kept your head high. That's not someone taking advantage. That's someone surviving against impossible odds with grace and dignity. Clara felt tears spilling over despite her best efforts to contain them. You see me more clearly than anyone ever has, she whispered. Even my parents, who loved me, never really understood who I was. But you... She shook her head, overwhelmed. You see all of it, the good and the bad, the strength and the fear, and you don't look away. Why would I look away from something beautiful? The word hung between them, charged with meaning. Neither of them was quite ready to confront directly. Beautiful. Not pretty or nice, or any of the bland compliments men used when they didn't know what else to say. Beautiful. A word that encompassed more than appearance, that spoke to something essential and valuable. Caleb seemed to realize he'd revealed more than he'd intended. He cleared his throat and gathered the reins, encouraging the horses forward. We should get back. Those clouds look like they mean business, and I'd rather not be caught in a storm. They rode in silence for several miles, but it was a different quality of silence than before, charged with awareness, heavy with things unsaid. Clara found herself acutely conscious of Caleb beside her, of the space between them on the wagon seat that felt both too far and too close. Something had shifted between them in that moment of raw honesty, something that couldn't be unshifted. The storm Caleb had predicted caught them halfway home, sudden and fierce as summer storms in the mountains often were. Rain came down in sheets, soaking them within seconds despite their attempts to huddle under the small canvas tarp Caleb pulled from the back of the wagon. Thunder crashed overhead, and lightning split the sky in brilliant forks that made the horses nervous. There! Caleb shouted over the noise, pointing to a small stand of trees that offered minimal shelter. He guided the wagon under the thickest canopy and tied the horses to keep them from bolting. They huddled together under the tarp, pressed close by necessity in the confined space. Clara was shivering, her dress soaked through and plastered to her body, her hair hanging in wet ropes down her back. Caleb wasn't much better, water streaming from his hat brim and his shirt clinging to his frame. Sorry, he said, his mouth close to her ear so she could hear him over the storm. Should have seen this coming sooner. Not your fault, Claire replied, teeth chattering. Weather out here seems to change in minutes. Another crack of thunder made her jump, and without thinking, she pressed closer to Caleb's solid warmth. His arm came around her shoulders automatically, pulling her against his side in a gesture that felt protective rather than presumptuous.
Clara let herself lean into him, accepting comfort she'd denied herself for weeks. They stayed that way as the storm raged around them, two people seeking shelter from more than just rain. Clara could feel Caleb's heartbeat through his wet shirt, steady and strong. Could smell the scent of him, soap and horses and something earthier that was just essentially him. Could feel the rise and fall of his breathing, the solid reality of his presence. Clara, Caleb said, and something in his tone made her look up at him. His face was inches from hers, water droplets clinging to his eyelashes, his expression serious and searching. I need to tell you something. What? Her own voice came out breathless, anticipatory. These past weeks, having you at the ranch, it's been more than just having help. It's been... He struggled for words, his usual eloquence deserting him. You make the place feel like more than just a house. You make it feel like a home. And when I think about you leaving, about the place being empty again... He stopped, shaking his head. I don't want you to go. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. Caleb, let me finish. I know we agreed this was temporary. I know you have plans, a life to build that doesn't necessarily include a rundown ranch in Montana, but I want you to know that if you wanted to stay, really stay, there would be a place for you here. Not as a housekeeper or a temporary guest, but as... He hesitated, then pushed forward with the courage that had made him offer her shelter in the first place. As my partner, my equal. Someone building this life with me instead of just passing through. Clara stared at him, stunned into silence by the declaration. This wasn't a proposal exactly, but it was something more than friendship, more than a business arrangement. It was an offering of something real and lasting, made without pretense or manipulation. I'm not saying you have to decide now, Caleb continued. I'm just saying the option is there. Take whatever time you need, but I wanted you to know how I feel, what I'm hoping for, before you make any decisions about leaving. The rain was starting to slow, the fury of the storm passing as quickly as it had arrived, but Clara barely noticed. All her attention was focused on Caleb, on the vulnerability in his eyes and the hope he was trying not to show too obviously. I don't know what to say, she admitted. I came here expecting nothing, wanting nothing except a few days to figure out my next move. I never imagined... She gestured helplessly, trying to encompass everything, the ranch, the work, the growing feelings she'd been trying to deny. This. You don't have to say anything right now, Caleb assured her. Just think about it. That's all I'm asking. They pulled apart as the rain reduced to a drizzle, both suddenly aware of their closeness and the intimacy of the moment. Caleb busied himself checking the horses, while Clara wrung water from her skirts and tried to organize her chaotic thoughts. The ride home was quiet again, but this time Clara's mind raced with possibilities and fears. Stay. The word echoed in her head with every turn of the wagon wheels. Stay. Build a life here. Let this temporary refuge become something permanent. It was tempting. God, it was so tempting. The work was hard but satisfying. The land was beautiful in a stark, honest way that appealed to something deep in her soul. And Caleb was everything Marcus Hendricks had pretended to be in his letters: kind, honest, hardworking, respectful. A man who saw her as an equal rather than as property or ornament. But Clara had been burned before. She'd trusted Marcus's letters, believed his promises, and traveled halfway across the country only to be discarded like defective merchandise. How could she trust that this was different? How could she be sure she wasn't just trading one form of dependence for another? And yet, whispered a small voice in the back of her mind, wasn't there a difference between choosing to stay and being trapped? Caleb had offered her a choice, had made it clear she could leave any time without judgment or anger. That wasn't control. That was freedom. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was breaking through the clouds, turning the wet grass into a field of diamonds. Steam rose from the ground in ethereal wisps, and somewhere a meadowlark sang its liquid song. It was beautiful, Clara thought. This place was genuinely, achingly beautiful. They unloaded the wagon in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. Clara took her damp packages inside while Caleb saw to the horses.
She changed into dry clothes and hung her wet dress by the fire to dry, moving through familiar routines that felt different now, weighted with new meaning. When Caleb came in, also changed into dry clothes, he found Clara staring out the window at the clearing sky. He moved to stand beside her, keeping a respectful distance but close enough that she could feel his presence. "I meant what I said earlier," he told her quietly. "No pressure, no expectations. Just know that you have a choice, a real choice, about what happens next." Clara turned to look at him, this man who'd saved her from humiliation and given her back her dignity. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything." "Do you—" She paused, gathering courage. "Do you have feelings for me? Real feelings, not just loneliness or convenience?" Caleb met her gaze steadily. "Yes, real feelings. The kind that make me watch for you when I'm working the far pastures, that make me bring you things from town just to see you smile, that make me lie awake at night thinking about conversations we've had and things I want to tell you. I'm falling for you, Clara, have been since that first day when you refused to let those gossiping hens at the gate see you cry." The honesty of it, the raw vulnerability, broke through the last of Clara's defenses. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I'm terrified of trusting again, of believing this is real and having it torn away. But I'm also—" She took a breath. "I'm also falling for you, for your kindness and your strength and the way you make me laugh, for the life we're building here even if I told myself it was temporary, for the person I'm becoming under this roof." "So what do we do?" Caleb asked. Clara thought about it, about all the risks and possibilities, about the woman she'd been and the woman she was becoming. And she made a decision that felt both terrifying and right. "We take it slow," she said. "We keep working together, living together, learning about each other. No rush, no pressure, just seeing where this goes. And if it works, if this feeling is real and lasting, then we'll know. We'll both know." Caleb's smile was like sunrise, slow and warm and full of promise. "I can live with that." He held out his hand and Clara took it, their fingers interlacing naturally. They stood that way for a long moment, watching the storm clouds retreat toward the eastern horizon and the world emerge fresh and rain-washed and full of possibility. Whatever came next, Clara thought, they would face it together, not as rescuer and rescued, not as employer and employee, but as two people building something real from the broken pieces of their separate pasts. It wasn't the fairy tale she'd imagined when she'd answered Marcus Hendricks's advertisement. It was better. It was real. The days following their conversation in the storm took on a different quality, as if the world itself had shifted slightly on its axis. Clara and Caleb moved around each other with a new awareness, careful and deliberate, in ways that were both thrilling and terrifying. Every casual touch, his hand on her elbow as he helped her over rough ground, her fingers brushing his when she handed him his coffee, carried weight now, acknowledgement of feelings spoken, and possibilities not yet fully explored. September arrived with cooler nights and the first hints of autumn color in the aspen groves that dotted the hillsides. The work grew more urgent as they prepared for winter, and Clara threw herself into it with fierce determination. She helped Caleb bring the cattle down from the high summer pastures, learning to ride well enough that she could actually be useful during the long days of herding. She harvested the last of the garden vegetables and spent evenings preserving everything they'd need to survive the cold months, pickles and jams and root vegetables stored carefully in the cellar. In the quiet moments between tasks, they talked, really talked, in ways Clara had never experienced with anyone before. Caleb shared stories about his childhood, about his father's stern but loving guidance, and his mother's death when he was 12. He described the weight of inheriting the ranch at 25. Younger than he'd expected, and the loneliness that had crept in over the years as friends married and moved away or gave up on ranching for easier lives in town. Clara, in turn, found herself revealing truths she'd kept buried for years. She told him about the real circumstances that had driven her west, not just the factory closing, but the debts she'd accumulated trying to help her dying aunt, the landlord who'd made increasingly inappropriate advances when she couldn't pay rent on time, the desperation that had made Marcus Hendricks's cold, business-like letters seem like salvation. She told him about the shame she'd felt standing at that gate, the crushing sense of worthlessness that had threatened to swallow her whole. "I kept thinking I must have done something wrong," she admitted one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "That maybe if I'd been prettier or more refined, or said the right things in my letters, he would have wanted me. It took me weeks to realize the problem wasn't me at all. He was looking for a fantasy, not a real person. No one could have lived up to whatever impossible standard he'd created in his head." "His loss," Caleb said simply, and the conviction in his voice made Claire's throat tight with emotion. If he'd taken the time to actually know you, he would have realized what he was throwing away. These conversations happened in stolen moments, while working side by side in the barn, during long rides to check distant fence lines, over dinners that stretched late into the evening. Caleb proved to be surprisingly well-read for a rancher, quoting poetry and discussing philosophy with an ease that spoke of long, solitary hours spent with books. Clara matched him thought for thought, and the intellectual stimulation was almost as intoxicating as the growing physical awareness between them. Because there was physical awareness, impossible to ignore even as they maintained careful boundaries. Clara caught herself watching the way Caleb moved, the fluid strength of his body honed by years of hard work, the way his hands looked when he demonstrated a new skill, competent and sure, the rare smile that transformed his face from handsome to devastating, and she knew he was watching her too, could feel his gaze following her across rooms, could see the heat in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking, but they kept their word to take things slowly, both too aware of what was at stake to rush. A wrong move now could destroy the fragile trust they were building, could turn this growing connection into something awkward and uncomfortable. So they waited, tested, learned each other's rhythms and patterns like musicians learning to play in harmony. The first real test came from an unexpected quarter. In mid-September, Marcus Hendricks showed up at the ranch. Clara was in the garden, harvesting the last of the potatoes, when she heard the sound of approaching horses. She straightened, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun, and felt her stomach drop when she recognized the man on the lead horse. Hendricks looked exactly as he had that terrible day in July, expensively dressed by frontier standards, sitting his horse with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his own importance. Behind him rode another man, younger and harder looking, wearing a gun belt low on his hips. A hired hand or bodyguard, Clara guessed, and the implication made her skin crawl. What kind of social call required armed backup? Caleb emerged from the barn, his expression shuddering into careful neutrality when he saw who his visitors were. He moved to position himself between Hendricks and the house, between Hendricks and Clara, she realized, with the subtle but unmistakable body language of protection. "Hendricks," Caleb said, his tone perfectly polite and perfectly cold. "What brings you to my property?" Hendricks dismounted with practiced ease, handing his reins to his companion. "Turner, I was hoping we could have a word about a matter of mutual concern. I can't imagine what that would be. We don't exactly run in the same circles. It's about Miss Whitfield." Hendricks's gaze flicked past Caleb to where Clara stood frozen in the garden, dirt on her dress and a basket of potatoes at her feet. Something unpleasant flickered across his face. "I see she's still here. That's unexpected." Clara found her voice and her courage simultaneously. She set down the basket and walked toward the men, refusing to cower or hide. "Mr. Hendricks, I'm surprised to see you. I was under the impression you'd made your feelings about my presence quite clear." Up close, Hendricks was exactly as she remembered, handsome in a polished, superficial way, with cold eyes that assessed and calculated rather than truly seeing. How had she ever thought she could build a life with this man? "Miss Whitfield," he nodded stiffly. "I've come to make you an offer. A second chance, if you will." The silence that followed was profound. Clara felt Caleb go rigid beside her, tension radiating from him in waves. She herself was too stunned to immediately respond. "A second chance?" she repeated finally, her voice flat with disbelief. "You rejected me at your gate, in front of witnesses, with a letter that questioned my honesty and criticized my appearance. And now you want to offer me a second chance?" Hendricks had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I may have been hasty in my initial assessment. I've given the matter more thought, and I believe we could still make a suitable match. You're clearly capable of hard work, and you've shown you can adapt to frontier life. Those are valuable qualities in a wife." "Valuable qualities?" Clara echoed, rage building in her chest like a physical force. "Like I'm livestock you're considering purchasing." "Now see here," Hendricks started, but Caleb cut him off. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly. You humiliated Clara in the worst possible way, left her stranded with nowhere to go, and now, 2 months later, you've decided she might be acceptable after all, and you thought the appropriate response would be to ride onto my property and make this magnanimous offer." Caleb's voice was dangerously quiet. "That's what's happening here? This is between myself and Miss Whitfield," Hendricks said stiffly. "It doesn't concern you, Turner." "Everything concerning Clara concerns me," Caleb replied, and Clara felt a warm rush of gratitude at the possessive certainty in his voice. "She's under my protection, which means you're going to treat her with respect, or you're going to leave. Those are your options." Hendricks' expression hardened. "I've heard the rumors about your arrangement. The whole town is talking about the mail-order bride living in Turner's house, sharing his roof, playing house like a couple of children. It's scandalous, and it's damaging both your reputations." "Well, let them talk," Clara said, finding her strength. "I'd rather be the subject of gossip while living honestly than be respectably miserable in a marriage based on nothing but convenience and contempt." "You don't know what you're saying," Hendricks argued. "A woman in your position, without family, without means, without prospects, you can't afford to be choosy. I'm offering you security, a respectable name, a place in society. What can Turner offer you that compares to that?" Clara looked at Caleb, at the man who'd taken her in when she had nothing, who'd taught her skills and respected her intelligence, who'd shared his home and his heart without asking for anything but honesty in return. The answer was so obvious it almost made her laugh. "Everything that matters," she said quietly. "Respect, partnership, freedom to be myself rather than whoever you decided I should be. And most importantly, a choice. Caleb gave me a choice about my own life. You never did." Hendricks's face flushed with anger. "You're making a mistake. Turner's ranch is barely profitable. One bad winter could wipe him out. And what then? Where will you be when he can't feed you anymore?" "Right beside him, working to make sure that doesn't happen," Clara shot back. "That's what partners do, Mr. Hendricks. They face challenges together rather than treating each other like assets to be acquired or discarded based on their utility." "You're being naive," Hendricks insisted. "Romance doesn't put food on the table or keep the cold out. You'll learn that soon enough." "Maybe," Caleb interjected, his patience clearly exhausted. "But she'll learn it on her own terms, making her own choices. Now, I believe Clara has made her position clear. Time for you to leave." For a moment, Hendricks looked like he might argue further. His companion's hand drifted toward his gun, and Clara felt Caleb shift his weight in response, positioning himself for quick movement. The tension stretched taut as a wire, and Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. Then Hendricks seemed to reconsider. He remounted his horse with jerky, angry movements. "You'll regret this, Turner, both of you. When winter comes and you're struggling to survive, remember I offered you a better option." "The only thing I regret," Clara said clearly, "is wasting 4 months writing letters to someone incapable of seeing past his own shallow expectations. Thank you for teaching me what I don't want in a marriage. It's made recognizing what I do want infinitely easier." Hendricks' expression twisted with fury and wounded pride. Without another word, he wheeled his horse around and spurred it into a gallop, his companion following. They watched until the riders disappeared over the rise, dust settling in their wake. The moment they were gone, Clara felt her legs start to shake. All the adrenaline that had kept her upright and defiant drained away, leaving her trembling. Caleb's arm came around her shoulders, steady and warm. "You were magnificent," he said softly. "The way you stood up to him, the things you said, Clara, that took real courage." "I was terrified," she admitted, leaning into his support. "When he said he wanted to give me a second chance, for just one moment I thought about all the practical reasons I should accept. Security, respectability, an end to gossip, all the things I came out here looking for in the first place." Caleb went very still. "And?" Clara pulled back enough to look at him, needing him to see the truth in her eyes. "And then I looked at you, and I remembered what real respect feels like. What it's like to be seen as a person, rather than a convenience. Hendricks was offering me a prison with nice bars. You've given me freedom. There's no comparison. Something blazed to life in Caleb's eyes, intense and unmistakable. His hand came up to cup her face, thumb brushing across her cheekbone with infinite gentleness. Clara, Mr. Turner, Miss Whitfield, a voice called from the road, and they sprang apart guiltily. A rider was approaching, a young man Clara vaguely recognized from town. He pulled up in front of them, slightly breathless. Sorry to interrupt, but there's trouble. Fire started on the Jacobson place. Lightning strike from last night finally caught. It's spreading fast with this dry wind, and they're calling for all hands. Every man who can work a shovel or swing a wet blanket. Caleb's expression shifted immediately to focus and concern. How bad? Bad enough. They're trying to keep it from reaching the house and barn, but they need help fast. I'll get my gear. Caleb was already moving toward the barn. He paused to look back at Clara. I have to go. Could be all night. Will you be all right here? Of course, Clara said immediately, pushing aside her own lingering fear from the confrontation. Go. Help them. I'll manage things here. Caleb hesitated, clearly torn between duty to his neighbors and reluctance to leave Clara alone so soon after Hendricks' visit. Clara made the decision for him by practically pushing him toward the barn. Go. I'm perfectly capable of managing for one night. I have the rifle you taught me to shoot, and Gertrude will sound the alarm if anyone approaches. I'll be fine. Within minutes, Caleb had saddled Charlie and packed supplies. He paused before mounting, looking at Clara with an expression that made her breath catch. When I get back, we need to talk, really talk, about where this is going. I know, Clara said, and I'll be here, I promise. He nodded, mounted, and was gone, following the young messenger toward the distant smudge of smoke visible on the horizon. Clara stood watching until they disappeared, then turned to face the suddenly very empty ranch. The silence felt oppressive after the chaos of the afternoon. Clara threw herself into evening chores, feeding animals, and securing the barn with mechanical efficiency while her mind raced. Hendricks' visit had crystallized something she'd been avoiding thinking about too directly. She couldn't keep pretending this was temporary. She couldn't keep telling herself she'd eventually move on to some vague, better opportunity that existed somewhere over the horizon. This was where she wanted to be. Not because she had nowhere else to go, but because this place, this ranch, this work, this man, had become home in ways Boston never had. The question wasn't whether she wanted to stay. The question was whether she was brave enough to fully commit to that decision, to risk her heart on the possibility of real love. Night fell, and Clara moved through the house lighting lamps, checking locks, doing all the small tasks that usually brought comfort. But tonight, everything felt charged with anticipation and anxiety. The confrontation with Hendricks had dredged up old fears. What if Caleb eventually decided she wasn't worth the trouble she brought? What if the gossip and social complications became too much? What if she was making the same mistake all over again, just with a kinder face? She tried to read but couldn't focus. Tried to sew but found her hands shaking too much for fine work. Finally, she simply sat by the window, watching the distant glow of the fire against the night sky and thinking about everything that had led her to this moment. Somewhere past midnight, exhaustion finally claimed her. She dozed in the chair, startling awake at every sound, until dawn light began creeping across the eastern sky. She made coffee with hands that fumbled from tiredness and worry, and was halfway through her first cup when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Caleb looked exhausted, his face streaked with soot and his clothes reeking of smoke. But his eyes found hers immediately as he dismounted, and the relief in them was palpable. "You're still here," he said, and Clara heard the fear underneath the words, fear that she might have used his absence to pack up and disappear rather than face the complicated feelings between them. "I promised I would be," Clara replied, setting down her cup and moving toward him. "How bad was it?" "We saved the house and barn. Lost some pasture land and a shed, but the family's safe and their home is intact. That's what matters." He swayed slightly, and Clara realized just how exhausted he must be. "Come inside, you need food and rest." "I need to tend to Charlie first, and—" "I'll tend to Charlie," Clara interrupted firmly. "You go inside, wash up, and sit down before you fall down. That's not a request." A ghost of a smile crossed Caleb's smoke-stained face. Yes, ma'am. While Caleb cleaned up, Clara took care of Charlie, removing his tack and rubbing him down with practiced efficiency before turning him into his stall with fresh water and grain. The familiar work steadied her nerves, gave her hands something to do while her mind continued its anxious circling. When she returned to the house, she found Caleb at the table, clean but still obviously exhausted. His wet hair stuck up in odd directions where he'd toweled it dry, and there were shadows under his eyes that spoke of a long, hard night. Clara prepared a simple breakfast, eggs, toast, the last of the bacon, and set it in front of him without comment. They ate in silence for several minutes before Caleb finally spoke. "Clara, about yesterday, about what you said to Hendricks." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Did you mean it? What you told him about choosing to stay here, about what we have being worth more than security or respectability?" Clara set down her fork and met his gaze directly. "Every word. I've spent the past 12 hours thinking about nothing else, actually. About what I want versus what I think I should want. About fear versus courage. About settling versus choosing. And I'm choosing this. Choosing you, choosing us, choosing the life we're building here. Not because I have no other options, Hendricks proved I do, however unappealing, but because this is what I genuinely want. Even with the hard work and the gossip and the uncertainty, even knowing that ranching is precarious and winters are harsh and there are no guarantees, I want this life. With you." Caleb's hand reached across the table to cover hers, and Clara saw her own emotions reflected in his face. Hope, fear, overwhelming relief. "I love you," he said simply. "I think I started falling for you that first day, watching you stand at that gate refusing to break down completely. And every day since, I've fallen a little more. The way you laugh when Gertrude steals vegetables from the garden. The way you hum while you work. The way you tackle every challenge like you've got something to prove to the world. I love all of it, all of you. And if you'll have me, if you'll take the risk of building a life here, I promise I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of that trust." Clara felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in months, they were tears of joy, rather than pain or fear. "I love you too," she whispered. "I didn't think I'd ever be brave enough to say those words again after everything that happened. But you made me brave, Caleb. You showed me what love actually looks like. Not possession or convenience, but partnership and respect and choosing each other every single day." Caleb stood, pulling Clara up with him, and then his arms were around her and she was pressed against his chest, breathing in the scent of soap and smoke and him. His hand cradled the back of her head, gentle and sure, while his other arm wrapped around her waist, holding her like she was precious, like she was chosen. "Marry me," Caleb said against her hair. "Not because you have nowhere else to go, not because it's practical or expected. Marry me because you want to, because you can imagine building a life together, because you love me the way I love you. Marry me, and make this official, make this real in a way that leaves no room for doubt or gossip or question." Clara pulled back just enough to see his face, to verify that he meant every word. What she saw there, love, determination, absolute certainty, made her smile through her tears. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you. Not because I need rescuing or security. Because I choose you, Caleb Turner. I choose this life, this ranch, this partnership. I choose us." His kiss was everything their relationship had been, honest, patient, building slowly from gentle to passionate as months of restrained longing finally found release. Clara melted into it, into him, feeling like she was finally, truly home after a lifetime of searching. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and slightly dazed, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "We should probably talk about practical things. When, where, how we want to do this." "Later," Clara said firmly. "Right now, you need to sleep. You've been up all night fighting a fire, and you're dead on your feet." "But later," she repeated, gently pushing him toward his bedroom. "Sleep for a few hours. The practical details will keep. The most important question has been answered." Caleb allowed himself to be shepherded to bed, too exhausted to argue. At his bedroom door, he paused. "Clara, thank you for waiting, for staying, for choosing me even when you had other options."
Always, she promised. Now sleep. She closed the door and leaned against it, letting the reality of what had just happened wash over her. She was engaged. Again. But this time, everything was different. This time, she knew the man, trusted him, loved him not for what he represented or what he could provide, but for who he actually was. Flaws, virtues, and all. Clara moved through the house in a daze, mechanically tidying and organizing while her mind spun through possibilities and plans. They'd need to go to town, talk to the minister, arrange a simple ceremony. She'd need a dress. Not anything fancy, but something nicer than her work clothes. They'd need witnesses, which meant facing down the gossips who'd been so cruel before, but Clara found she didn't care. Let them talk. She and Caleb knew the truth of their relationship, and that was all that mattered. She was sitting on the porch, ostensibly mending a shirt, but mostly just staring dreamily at the mountains, when she heard a wagon approaching. Her first instinct was alarm. What if Hendricks had returned? But she quickly recognized the conveyance as belonging to the Jacobsons, the family whose ranch had burned. A woman around Clara's age climbed down from the driver's seat, her dress dusty and her face tired but smiling. "Miss Whitfield, I'm Sarah Jacobson. I wanted to come by and thank you and Mr. Turner. If it wasn't for all the neighbors who came to help last night, we would have lost everything." Clara stood, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. "Please sit. I'm glad they could save your home. Can I get you some water? Coffee?" "Water would be lovely, thank you." When Clara returned with 2 glasses, Sarah was sitting with her head tipped back, eyes closed, looking utterly exhausted. She accepted the water gratefully and drank half of it in one long swallow. "I apologize for my appearance," Sarah said. "I've been up all night helping to watch for spot fires, and I probably should have gone home to rest before making social calls. But I wanted to catch you while I had the courage." "Courage?" Clara asked, puzzled. Sarah looked uncomfortable. "I need to apologize. I was one of the women in the store that day when they were saying cruel things about you and Mr. Turner. I didn't participate, but I didn't speak up either. I just stood there and let them tear you down, and I've felt terrible about it ever since. You didn't deserve that, and I should have said something." Clara was startled by the unexpected apology. "That's kind of you to say, but—" "No, please let me finish," Sarah interrupted. "The truth is, I was jealous. My husband and I have been struggling since we came out here. The ranch barely supports us, and every year it's a fight to make ends meet. When I heard about you, this woman from back east who'd been rejected but somehow landed on her feet, who'd found work and shelter with a good man like Turner, I was envious. Instead of being happy for you, I let the gossips tear you down because it made me feel better about my own situation. That was wrong." Clara studied the other woman, seeing genuine remorse in her eyes. "Thank you for telling me that. It takes courage to admit when we've been less than our best selves." "The other women, the ones who are actually cruel, they're not going to apologize," Sarah continued. "They'll probably never admit they were wrong. But I wanted you to know that not everyone in town thinks badly of you. Some of us," she smiled tentatively, "some of us would actually like to be your friend, if you'd be willing." The offer caught Clara off guard. In all her time at the ranch, she'd been so focused on proving herself to Caleb, on earning her place and figuring out her feelings, that she hadn't considered the possibility of female friendship. The idea was unexpectedly appealing. "I'd like that," Clara said honestly. "I'd like that very much." They talked for another hour, Sarah sharing stories about ranch life and the challenges she and her husband faced, Clara opening up about her own journey from Boston to Montana. By the time Sarah stood to leave, promising to visit again soon, Clara felt lighter somehow. She'd found not just a home and a partner, but the beginnings of community. As she watched Sarah's wagon disappear down the road, Clara reflected on how much her life had changed in just 3 months. She'd arrived in Montana as a mail-order bride, rejected and humiliated, with nothing but a trunk of belongings and $3 to her name. Now she was engaged to a man she genuinely loved, had skills and confidence she'd never possessed before, and was beginning to build the kind of connections that turned a place into a home. It wasn't the life she'd imagined when she'd boarded that train in Boston. It was better. It was real and complicated and sometimes difficult, but it was hers. She'd chosen it, and it had chosen her back. The sun was starting its descent toward the western horizon when Caleb finally emerged from his room, looking more rested but still somewhat dazed. He found Clara in the kitchen preparing supper, and the domestic normalcy of the scene seemed to ground him. "Did I dream this morning?" he asked from the doorway. "Or did you actually say yes?" Clara turned to face him, unable to keep the smile from her face. "You didn't dream it. I said yes." "I'm saying yes. I'll keep saying yes as many times as you need to hear it." Caleb crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms, kissing her soundly. When they broke apart, both were grinning like fools. "So," Clara said, her hands resting on his chest, "about those practical details we need to discuss. When do you want to get married?" "Tomorrow," Caleb said immediately. "Right now. As soon as humanly possible." Clara laughed. "Be serious. We need to talk to the minister, get a license, arrange witnesses. It'll take at least a week or 2 to organize properly." 2 weeks then, Caleb agreed. "Not a day longer. I've waited 7 years for this feeling, Clara. I'm not interested in a long engagement." 2 weeks, Clara confirmed. "We'll ride into town tomorrow, start making arrangements, face down the gossips together, and show them we don't care what they think." "Together," Caleb agreed, and the word carried weight beyond simple logistics. Together. It was a promise and a commitment, a declaration that whatever challenges came, they would face them as partners. That evening, they sat on the porch as the stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky. Caleb had pulled Clara into his lap, and she leaned back against his chest, his arms wrapped around her waist, both of them content just to be close after months of careful distance. "Tell me something," Clara said softly. "When you found me at that gate, did you have any idea it would lead to this?" Caleb was quiet for a moment, considering. "No," he admitted finally. "I just saw someone who needed help and couldn't walk away. But somewhere between that day and this one, you stopped being a stranger I was helping and became the person I can't imagine my life without. I don't know exactly when it happened. Maybe it was watching you tackle the garden with such determination. Maybe it was the first time you made me laugh. Maybe it was seeing you stand up to those women in town. Or maybe it was all of it together, every small moment building into something I couldn't ignore anymore." Clara twisted in his arms to look at him. "I was so angry when Hendricks rejected me. I felt like my life was over, like I'd traveled all that way for nothing. But if he hadn't turned me away, I would have married him. I would have spent my life with a man who saw me as property, who would have slowly crushed every part of me that makes me who I am. Hendricks's rejection was the best thing that could have happened to me, because it led me to you." "Fate," Caleb murmured. "Or luck. Or maybe just the universe correcting a mistake before it became permanent." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the night deepen around them. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called, its voice rising in a series of yips and howls. Gertrude answered from her shed with an indignant bleat. The familiar sounds of their world, the symphony of the ranch at night. "I want to make you a promise," Caleb said suddenly. "Not part of wedding vows or anything formal, just something between us." "All right. I promise that I will never take you for granted, never treat you like your thoughts and feelings don't matter, never make you feel like you're less than my equal partner in everything we build. And if I ever do, even accidentally, I want you to call me on it immediately. Deal?" Clara felt tears prickling at her eyes again. "Deal. And I promise the same. I promise to be honest about what I need and want, even when it's hard. To trust you with my fears and doubts, not just my strengths. To remember that we're building this together, not me fitting into your life or you into mine, but creating something new that belongs to both of us." They sealed the promises with a kiss that tasted like coffee and possibility and home. And as the Montana night deepened around them, Clara felt the last of her fears and doubts dissolve. This was right. This was real. This was love as it was meant to be, not a rescue or a compromise, but a choice made freely by 2 people who'd found each other against impossible odds. Tomorrow, they would ride to town and begin the practical business of planning a wedding. There would be paperwork and arrangements, gossip to face, and social complications to navigate. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight was just for them, for the joy of knowing they'd found something rare and precious in a world that didn't always reward courage or hope. Tomorrow would come soon enough, with all its challenges and possibilities. But tonight, Clara Whitfield and Caleb Turner sat together under the vast Montana sky, two people who'd been broken in different ways, now healing each other simply by choosing to stay. The morning they rode into town to arrange their wedding dawned clear and crisp, autumn asserting itself with the kind of crystalline light that made everything seem sharper, more vivid. Clara dressed carefully in her best dress, the dark blue one she'd been wearing the day Caleb found her, now cleaned and mended. She pinned her hair with extra care, wanting to look respectable and confident when they faced the minister and inevitably the gossips who would have plenty to say about this development. Caleb was waiting by the wagon when she emerged, and the look on his face when he saw her made her breath catch. It wasn't the hungry appraisal she'd learned to fear from men, but something deeper, appreciation mixed with love, and a tenderness that made her feel both vulnerable and completely safe. "You look beautiful," he said simply, offering his hand to help her up. "I look presentable," Clara corrected, but she was smiling. "There's a difference." "Not from where I'm standing." They rode mostly in comfortable silence, both lost in their own thoughts about what lay ahead. The decision to marry had been easy, made in a moment of emotional honesty that felt absolutely right. But the practical reality of announcing that decision to a community that had already judged them harshly was more daunting. Clara tried to prepare herself for criticism, for insinuations that she'd trapped Caleb or that he was making a terrible mistake. She told herself their opinions didn't matter, that the only judgment that counted was their own. But the truth was, it did matter, not because she needed their approval, but because she and Caleb would be building a life in this community. Their children, if they were blessed with any, would grow up here. The isolation of the ranch was beautiful, but not absolute. They would need neighbors for help during emergencies, would trade goods and services, would be part of the social fabric whether they wanted to be or not. Making peace with the town, or at least establishing their right to be left alone, was important. The church sat at the edge of town, a simple white building with a steeple that pointed toward heaven with frontier optimism. Reverend Matthews, a kindly man in his 60s with wire-rimmed spectacles and a genuine warmth, greeted them at the door of his small office attached to the church. "Mr. Turner, what a pleasant surprise. And Miss Whitfield, isn't it? Please come in, sit down. What can I do for you?" Caleb glanced at Clara, and she nodded, giving him permission to speak for them both. "Reverend, Clara and I would like to be married, as soon as possible if you can arrange it." If the Reverend was surprised, he hit it well. He simply folded his hands on his desk and regarded them both with calm assessment. "I see. And this is a decision you've both made freely? Miss Whitfield, you're certain this is what you want?" Clara appreciated that he asked her directly rather than treating her as an appendage to Caleb's will. "I'm certain, Reverend, more certain than I've ever been about anything." "Well then, let's discuss the details. By law, you'll need a license from the county clerk. There's a 3-day waiting period, so the earliest we could perform the ceremony would be—" He consulted a calendar on his desk. "Saturday next, if that suits you. Do you have witnesses in mind?" "We'll find someone," Caleb said, though his tone suggested he hadn't thought that far ahead. "Maybe the Jacobsons? Sarah visited yesterday, seemed friendly enough." "The Jacobsons would be fine witnesses," Reverend Matthews agreed. "Now, about the ceremony itself. I assume you'll want something simple." "Very simple," Clara confirmed. "Nothing elaborate, just the vows and whatever readings are traditional." They spent the next hour going over details. The time of the ceremony, the few legal formalities required, the minimal cost for the Reverend's services. Throughout, Reverend Matthews treated them with dignity and kindness, never once suggesting there was anything improper about their union or asking invasive questions about how they'd come to this decision. By the time they left his office, Clara felt lighter, as if clearing this first hurdle made everything else more manageable. The county clerk's office was a different story. The clerk himself, a thin man with a permanent expression of suspicion, looked Clara up and down with obvious disapproval when they requested a marriage license. "This the Turner Ranch?" he asked, consulting some internal record. "You're Caleb Turner, son of William Turner?" "That's right. And you, miss, you're the one who was supposed to marry Marcus Hendricks but got turned away?" Clara felt Caleb tense beside her, but she kept her voice level. "I'm Clara Whitfield, yes, and Mr. Hendricks and I mutually agreed not to proceed with our engagement. Is that relevant to our request for a marriage license?" The clerk sniffed.
Just making sure all the information is accurate for the records. Wouldn't want any confusion about identities or intentions. He pulled out the necessary forms with exaggerated slowness. You understand there's a 3-day waiting period. Can't get married before that, no matter how urgent your need might be. The insinuation in his tone was clear, and Clara felt her temper flare. But before she could respond, Caleb leaned forward, his voice deadly quiet. We understand the legal requirements perfectly well. What we don't understand is why you feel entitled to comment on our personal business. We're here for a license, not your opinion. Can you provide the service you're paid to provide? Or do we need to speak to your supervisor about your conduct? The clerk's face flushed, but he began filling out the forms without further commentary. They completed the process in tense silence, and Clara had never been more grateful to leave a building than when they finally stepped back out into the autumn sunshine. I'm sorry, Caleb said immediately. I should have known there'd be people like that. Should have prepared you better. You can't prepare someone for small-minded cruelty, Claire replied. And you defended me perfectly. That's all I need, knowing you'll stand beside me when people decide to be ugly. They walked down the main street toward the general store, needing to purchase a few supplies while they were in town. Clara was acutely aware of the attention they were drawing, conversations that stopped when they approached, eyes that followed their progress, whispers that started up again in their wake. It was exhausting being the subject of so much speculation, but she kept her head high and her hand tucked into the crook of Caleb's elbow. Inside the general store, George Morrison greeted them with professional courtesy. Mr. Turner, Miss Whitfield, back so soon? What can I help you with today? Just need some flour, sugar, and coffee, Caleb said. And Miss Whitfield needs fabric. She's going to need a new dress. Special occasion? George asked, and there was genuine curiosity rather than malice in his tone. A wedding, Clara said clearly, deciding that honesty was better than trying to hide their plans. We're getting married next Saturday at the church. Reverend Matthews is performing the ceremony. George's eyebrows rose, but his smile seemed genuine. Well, congratulations to you both. That's wonderful news, Martha, he called toward the back room. Come out here. We have some news to share. His wife emerged, a plump woman with kind eyes and flour dusting her apron. She took in Clara and Caleb standing together, the way they stood close with easy familiarity, and her face broke into a genuine smile. You're getting married. Oh, how lovely. When? Saturday week, Caleb said. Nothing fancy, just a simple ceremony at the church. Well, you'll need a proper dress for that, Martha declared, moving immediately to the fabric section. Let's see what we have that would work. What's your coloring? Blues, I think, to bring out your eyes. And we have this lovely cream-colored cotton that would be perfect for a wedding dress. Simple, but elegant. Clara found herself swept up in Martha's enthusiasm, discussing fabrics and patterns with a warmth that was completely unexpected. For the next hour, Martha helped her select not just material for a wedding dress, but also fabric for 2 additional everyday dresses, insisting that a newly married woman needed a proper wardrobe. Now don't worry about the cost, Martha said when Clara protested. We can set up an account, let you pay it off over time. That's what neighbors do. Help each other out when it's needed. The kindness was overwhelming, especially after the clerk's cruelty. Clara felt tears threatening and blinked them back fiercely. Thank you, Mrs. Morrison. You've been incredibly generous. Call me Martha, dear, and it's my pleasure. Heaven knows this town needs more good news and fewer vicious rumors. You and Mr. Turner seem to genuinely care for each other, and that's worth celebrating. As they were finalizing their purchases, the door opened and Sarah Jacobson entered, accompanied by a tall man who could only be her husband. Sarah's face lit up when she saw Clara. Miss Whitfield, I was hoping I'd run into you. This is my husband, Tom. Tom, this is Miss Whitfield and Mr. Turner. The men shook hands while Sarah moved to stand beside Clara, lowering her voice. I heard you were in town. The gossip mill works fast around here. We're giving them plenty to talk about, Clara admitted. We're getting married next Saturday. Sarah's squeal of delight made everyone in the store turn to look. That's wonderful. Oh, I'm so happy for you both. You must let Tom and me be your witnesses. Please? I would love to be part of this. Clara glanced at Caleb, who nodded his agreement. We'd be honored, Clara said. Thank you. By the time they left the store, word had spread throughout town that Caleb Turner and Clara Whitfield were getting married.
The reactions were mixed. Some people offered genuine congratulations. Others made their disapproval clear through cold stares and pointed silence. But Clara found she cared less than she'd expected. For every person who judged them, there was someone like Sarah or Martha who offered kindness and support. That balance was enough. The ride home was quiet but companionable, both of them processing the day's events. As the ranch came into view, Clara felt a surge of affection for the place that had become home. The simple house with its blue curtains fluttering in the windows. The barn where Gertrude was probably causing trouble. The garden she'd coaxed back to life. The vast sweep of land and sky that had taught her what freedom actually meant. "Having second thoughts?" Caleb asked, misreading her silence. "No," Clara said firmly. "Quite the opposite. I was just thinking how much I love this place. How much I love the life we're building here. Even with judgmental clerks and gossips? Even with them. They're just noise, Caleb. What we have is real." The week that followed was a whirlwind of preparation. Clara spent every spare moment working on her wedding dress, sewing late into the night by lamplight. Martha Morrison had helped her cut the pattern, and Sarah Jacobson had stopped by twice to offer assistance and encouragement. The dress was simple but beautiful. Cream cotton with modest trim at the sleeves and neckline, fitted at the waist and falling in graceful folds to her ankles. When she tried on the nearly finished garment, she barely recognized the woman in the mirror. Not the desperate factory girl from Boston, not the humiliated mail-order bride at the gate, but someone new, someone confident and loved and choosing her own path. Caleb, meanwhile, threw himself into ranch work with extra intensity, as if trying to tire himself out enough to sleep through his nervous excitement. He brought the last of the cattle down from the high pastures, repaired fences that didn't strictly need repairing, and organized the barn with meticulous attention to detail. In the evenings, they sat together on the porch, talking about their future with a mix of practical planning and dreaming. "I want to expand the cattle operation eventually," Caleb said one night. "Build up the herd over the next few years until we're running 100 head or more. It'll mean more work, but also more stability. And I want to start selling preserves and baked goods in town," Clara added. "Martha mentioned the store would buy whatever I could produce. It's not much, but every bit of extra income helps." "We'll need to think about the future," Caleb said carefully. "About family. Do you want children?" Clara had been expecting this question, had thought about it constantly over the past weeks. "I do," she said honestly. "Not right away. I want time for us to build our foundation first. But yes, eventually. I want to fill this house with life and laughter. Want to raise children who know what it means to work hard and love deeply and treat people with respect." "That sounds perfect," Caleb murmured, pulling her closer. "Everything about this sounds perfect." The night before the wedding, Sarah insisted that Clara stay at the Jacobson ranch, citing tradition that the bride and groom shouldn't see each other the day of the ceremony. Clara agreed, partly because Sarah was so enthusiastic about the plan, and partly because she needed the distraction of female company to keep her from overthinking everything. Sarah's house was smaller than the Turner Ranch, but warm and welcoming, filled with the cheerful chaos of a young marriage still finding its rhythm. Over dinner, Tom and Sarah shared stories about their own wedding 3 years earlier, the challenges they'd faced establishing their ranch, the dreams they still held for the future. "It's not easy," Sarah admitted as they sat up late sewing final touches on Clara's dress. "The work is endless, the money's always tight, and there are days I wonder if we made a mistake trying to make a life out here. But then Tom comes in from checking the cattle, and he looks at me the way your Caleb looks at you, and I remember why we chose this. It's about building something together, creating a life that's ours on our own terms." "Were you afraid?" Clara asked. "Before you got married, were you scared?" "Terrified," Sarah laughed. "I kept thinking about all the things that could go wrong, all the ways we might fail. But Tom told me something that stuck with me. He said fear is just proof that you care about the outcome. If you weren't afraid, it would mean you had nothing invested. So I decided to be brave and scared at the same time, and somehow that worked." Clara thought about that as she lay in Sarah's spare bedroom that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to unfamiliar house sounds. Brave and scared at the same time. That described exactly how she felt. Terrified of making another mistake, of trusting the wrong person,
of building her life on foundations that might crumble, but also brave enough to try anyway, to believe that Caleb was different, that what they had was real and lasting. Morning came with pale sunlight and nervous energy that made Clara's hands shake as she dressed. Sarah helped her into the wedding dress, fastening the long row of buttons down the back with patient fingers. When Clara was finally ready, Sarah stepped back with tears in her eyes. "You look absolutely beautiful. Caleb's going to forget how to breathe when he sees you." They arrived at the church to find a small crowd gathered, not just the handful of people Clara had expected, but nearly 24 townspeople dressed in their Sunday best. Martha Morrison was there with her husband, several other merchants from town, and a surprising number of ranching families Clara didn't know well, but who'd apparently decided to attend anyway. "Word got around," Sarah whispered. "People are curious, but I think most of them are genuinely happy for you." The church interior was simple, but had been decorated with wildflowers, someone's thoughtful gesture that made Clara's throat tight with emotion. Reverend Matthews waited at the altar, his kind face reassuring, and there, standing beside him in a suit Clara had never seen him wear, was Caleb. Sarah had been right. The look on his face when he saw Clara walking down the aisle was worth every moment of doubt and fear she'd experienced. He looked stunned, awestruck, like he couldn't quite believe this was really happening. Clara felt her own nervousness dissolve in the face of his obvious emotion. This was right. This was real. This was love. She reached the altar and took Caleb's offered hand, feeling the slight tremor in his fingers that told her he was just as nervous as she was. Reverend Matthews smiled at them both and began the ceremony. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Caleb Turner and Clara Whitfield in holy matrimony. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly, but reverently, thoughtfully, and in the knowledge that love requires not just emotion, but commitment, not just feeling, but action." The Reverend's words washed over Clara, familiar phrases that took on new meaning in this context. When he asked if anyone knew why these two should not be joined, there was a moment of tense silence before he continued. Clara had half expected Marcus Hendricks to appear and object, some dramatic scene from a novel, but the church remained peaceful and the ceremony proceeded. "Caleb, do you take Clara to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death do you part?" "I do." Caleb's voice was firm, clear, leaving no room for doubt. "Clara, do you take Caleb to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death do you part?" Clara looked into Caleb's eyes and saw her entire future reflected there. The challenges and joys, the hard work and tender moments, the life they would build together one day at a time. "I do." "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, and in the sight of God and these witnesses, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Caleb, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was brief, mindful of their audience, but it carried the weight of promises made and futures entwined. When they broke apart, the church erupted in applause, and Clara felt tears of joy streaming down her face. They signed the marriage register with Tom and Sarah as witnesses, making everything legal and official. Then they emerged from the church into bright autumn sunshine, pelted with rice by laughing well-wishers. Several people approached to offer congratulations, and Clara was surprised to find even some of the women who'd been cruel in the general store months ago were now politely friendly, as if marriage had somehow legitimized her existence in their eyes. Martha Morrison had organized a small reception at the hotel. Nothing elaborate, just cake and punch and sandwiches, but the gesture was generous and appreciated. For 2 hours, Clara and Caleb mingled with townspeople, accepting congratulations and fielding questions about their plans. It was exhausting, but also affirming, proof that they had more support in the community than they'd realized. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, they made their excuses and headed home. The wagon ride was filled with a different quality of silence than before, anticipation mixed with a hint of nervousness about the wedding night that lay ahead. "Are you happy?" Caleb asked as they turned onto the road leading to the ranch. "Deliriously," Clara replied honestly. "More than I ever thought possible." "You?"
I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and find this was all a dream, that you're not really my wife, that I'm still living alone in that house, wondering if I'll ever find someone to share my life with. It's real, Clara assured him, squeezing his hand. I'm really your wife. You're really my husband. We're really going to build this life together. The ranch looked perfect as they approached, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. Someone, probably Sarah during one of her visits, had hung a wreath of autumn leaves and berries on the front door. Small touch, but it made the house look festive, celebratory. Caleb helped Clara down from the wagon, but instead of setting her on her feet, he lifted her into his arms. Clara laughed, surprised. "What are you doing?" "Carrying my bride over the threshold. It's tradition, isn't it?" "I think that tradition is meant for the first time entering your home together." "This is the first time you're entering as my wife," Caleb pointed out. "Seems like it counts." He carried her up the porch steps and through the door, setting her down gently in the main room. The space looked the same, but felt different, charged with new meaning. This wasn't just the house where Clara had found refuge anymore. This was their home, the place where they would build their married life together. "I have something for you," Caleb said, suddenly seeming nervous. He moved to his bedroom, their bedroom now, Clara realized with a flutter of anticipation, and returned with a small wooden box. "I made this. It's not much, but I wanted to give you something that meant more than just a purchased gift." Clara opened the box to find a delicate hair comb, hand-carved from some light wood that had been polished to a soft sheen. The design was simple but elegant, showing real skill and care in its creation. "Caleb, it's beautiful. You made this?" "I've been working on it in the evenings when you were busy with other things. Used to do woodworking with my father when I was young, and I thought—" He trailed off, looking uncertain. "I thought you should have something that was made specifically for you, not just bought from a catalog or a store. Something that shows I was thinking about you, planning for this." Clara felt tears threatening again, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. "Help me put it in?" Caleb's hands were gentle as he gathered her hair and secured the comb, his fingers lingering on her neck in a way that made her shiver with awareness. When he was done, she turned to face him, and the expression in his eyes made her breath catch. "Clara Turner," he said softly, testing out her new name. "My wife." "Your wife," she agreed, and then his mouth was on hers and thinking became impossible. They made their way to the bedroom in a haze of kisses and fumbling with buttons, nervous laughter mixing with gasps of discovery as they learned the geography of each other's bodies. Clara had been afraid this part might be awkward or frightening, colored by warnings she'd heard from other women about wifely duties and male appetites. But with Caleb, everything felt natural, right. He was patient and attentive, checking in with her constantly, making sure every step was something they both wanted. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Clara's head on Caleb's chest and his arm around her shoulders. Through the window, stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky, the same vast Montana heavens Clara had marveled at that first night in this house. "I love you," Caleb murmured into her hair. "I know I've said it before, but it feels different now. More permanent, more real." "I love you too," Clara replied. "And you're right, it does feel different. Like we've crossed some threshold, and there's no going back, only forward together." They talked quietly as the night deepened, making plans and sharing dreams with the easy intimacy of newlyweds. Eventually, exhaustion claimed them both, and they drifted off to sleep wrapped in each other's arms. Clara woke once in the deep hours of the night, momentarily disoriented. Then she felt Caleb's warmth beside her, heard his steady breathing, and remembered. She was married. She had a home, a partner, a future that was hers to shape. The scared, desperate woman who'd stood at Marcus Hendrick's gate seemed like a distant memory, someone from another lifetime entirely. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the factory closing, the desperate search for options, the humiliation of rejection, the unexpected kindness of a stranger. Every painful step had been necessary to lead her to this moment, this place, this man. If any single thing had happened differently, she might never have found this happiness. Claire settled back against Caleb's side, letting her eyes close. Tomorrow they would wake up as husband and wife and begin the real work of building a life together. There would be challenges ahead, Harsh winters and financial struggles, gossip and judgment, all the thousand difficulties that came with frontier ranching. But they would face them together, partners in every sense of the word. The months that followed were a revelation. Clara discovered that marriage to Caleb was everything she'd hoped for, and nothing like she'd feared. They worked together with increasing efficiency, developing routines and rhythms that made the ranch run smoothly. Caleb taught her everything he knew about cattle and horses, treating her as a genuine partner rather than an assistant. Clara expanded her preserves business, selling to Martha Morrison and several other merchants who appreciated the quality of her work. Winter came with its expected hardships: brutal cold, heavy snows, days when venturing outside felt like facing down a physical enemy. But the house stayed warm, the animals stayed fed, and Clara and Caleb stayed close, using the forced indoor time to deepen their knowledge of each other. They read aloud by firelight, played cards and chess, made love with increasing confidence and joy. The isolation that had once seemed oppressive became precious. Time carved out of the world for just the two of them. Spring arrived like the benediction, melting the snow and coaxing green from the brown earth. Clara planted an expanded garden, ambitious with plans for what they could grow and preserve. Caleb successfully bred several of his horses, and the foals that arrived were healthy and strong, promising future income. The ranch slowly became more prosperous, not wealthy, but stable, sustainable. And one morning in early summer, Clara woke with a suspicion that became certainty over the following weeks. She was pregnant, carrying their first child, the next generation of Turners, who would grow up knowing this land and this life. When she told Caleb, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for: joy, wonder, and a tenderness that made her weep happy tears. He placed his hand on her still flat stomach with such reverence it took her breath away. "A baby," he whispered. "Our baby. Clara, we're going to be parents." "Are you ready for that?" she asked, needing to hear him say it. "No," he admitted with a laugh. "I have no idea what I'm doing, but I'm ready to figure it out with you, to learn as we go." That's what we've been doing all along, isn't it? Learning together, building together, becoming who we're meant to be side by side. Clara thought about the woman she'd been when she'd first arrived at this ranch. Broken, scared, uncertain of her own worth. And she thought about who she was now: strong, confident, loved, and loving in return. The transformation hadn't been instant or easy, but it had been real. Every challenge she'd faced, every moment of doubt she'd overcome, had been necessary to bring her to this point. She looked around at the house they'd made a home, at the land they were nurturing into productivity, at the man who'd seen her potential when she could barely see it herself, and she felt a deep, abiding sense of gratitude for the strange path that had led her here. Yes, she'd answered an advertisement and traveled across the country to marry a stranger. Yes, she'd been rejected and humiliated, left standing at a gate with nothing but a trunk and $3 to her name. But that rejection had led to rescue, and rescue had led to partnership, and partnership had led to love. The ending she'd been denied with Marcus Hendricks had been the wrong ending for the wrong story. This, the Turner Ranch, Caleb's arms, the baby growing inside her. This was the right ending, or rather the right beginning. Years later, when people asked her about how she'd met her husband, Clara would tell the story honestly, about being a mail-order bride who'd been rejected at first sight, about the cowboy who'd offered her shelter when she had nowhere else to go, about the slow transformation of charity into partnership and partnership into love. She never sugarcoated the painful parts or pretended it had been easy, but she always ended the story the same way, with her hand in Caleb's and their children playing in the yard of the ranch they'd built together. "Sometimes," she would say, "the worst thing that can happen to you turns out to be the best thing in disguise, because if Marcus Hendricks had accepted me, I would never have found what I was really looking for. Not security or status or escape from poverty, but a real home, a true partner, and a love that chose me just as much as I chose it." And Caleb would squeeze her hand and add, "Best day of my life was the day I found you at that gate. Changed everything. Made me remember what I was living for." Their children would roll their eyes at the familiar story, the way children do when their parents get sentimental. But Clara hoped that someday they would understand that the greatest gifts often come disguised as disasters, that rejection can be redirection,
and that sometimes you have to lose the life you plan to find the life that's been waiting for you all along. The Montana sun would set over their land, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson and purple. Gertrude would bleat from her shed, calling for her evening feeding. The cattle would low from the far pastures, and Clara would stand on the porch of the house that had become her home, surrounded by the family that had become her world, feeling more blessed than she'd ever imagined possible. From abandoned bride to beloved wife, from homeless wanderer to rooted homemaker, from someone defined by what others thought of her to someone secure in her own worth. The journey had been painful and uncertain, but every step had been worth it. Because Clara Whitfield Turner had found what so many people searched their whole lives for and never find. A place where she was loved not for what she could provide or how she appeared, but simply for who she was. And that, she knew with absolute certainty, was worth more than all the security and respectability